some of the work that we are doing in terms of the alfalfa and other forage, especially like corn pest management. And the presentation that I will have today is we'll cover like only two of the pests that we have in our system. One we just finished, and this one is the Alfalfa Weevil. We just finished them, or finished some efficacy work on it, and also some bioassays for resistance. And the other insect that we are dealing with, it will be like spider mite in corn. We'll just touch base on some of the efficacy trials that we were doing over the last few years. We'll start with the Alfalfa Weevil. We know this is a winter pest. It starts usually in January when temperature getting down in the low desert here. We usually have, it has a very standard way of sampling them using sweep nets, 5 sweep if you like, have your field into like 4 quadrants, and you take 5 sweep from each of these quadrants, and you have your average number. For many years, we have like this, what we call threshold here that have been established in California, and it was 15 to 20 larvae per sweep, depend on whether it's small or large larva. But for many years, this threshold never been practiced in our area. And this is some of the code of some of our PC and growers. They cannot wait to reach even half of that number. If they get that much weevil in the net, they will end up with white alfalfa, which means we don't have any leaflet on it. And said, I'm not in business of selling alfalfa straw. And this is again some of the response that we collected from some of you when we were dealing with this problem. So over the last few years, we have been conducted several studies, and it's now part of our assistant and extension here, Kyle Harrington, PhD, and we work on establishing, realistic threshold for this alfalfa weevil. So what we did is that we tried to manipulate the population of this insect in blood designs in Maricopa Center or MAC. And we did that through applying some insecticide application. We applied, different insecticide. We applied different rate based on our knowledge of their efficacies. The purpose of this application, not to study the efficacies of this product, but rather to establish different population densities of the larva of this insect. And again, it's these densities we get the yield, or we assess the yield. And from there, we get the relationship between the larval population of alfalfa weevil and the yield that we are harvesting at the end. So this is one of the designs that we have, and this is one of our demonstration here at MAG. What we found over the year, and this is not a surprise, is that there is a stronger relationship and correlation between the population of larvae and the yield of alfalfa. It's no surprise, but our surprise was the strong relationship between the large larva, which is like here in this red box here. This is like the larva from the third and star on, not the small one, and not any other insect that you can find in your sweep net, like this hopper or this aphid or like camelback or humpback alfalfa hopper here. But the relationship between this large larva and the yield. And we found like the threshold that we are dealing with is really quite lower than what we have been know before during the last few years, the 15 to 20. Rather, we found like you can get some damage even with one large larva. This is here one of the tables that we shared sometimes about the relationship between the population of the insect, the price of hay as dollar per ton, and the cost of treatment for these insects. And the relationship here, if you have a higher price for your hay, it will mean that you have a lower threshold if we fix the cost of treatment. So this is one scenario here where we fix the cost of treatment, and this is the cost of everything, of the chemical, of the labor, depreciation on your equipment, and so on, fuel. We fixed it at $30. And we have a range here of price of hay per ton between $250 to $320. And here you need to apply some kind of treatment when you have one large larva per sweep. That's quite different, of course, from the previous one. Of course, when you have a lower price for your hay, and here we are talking about a range of like 170 to 100, you can like apply, or your application could be justified when you have two of these large larvae per sweep. And so going on, if you have a lower price here up to like 140, between 160 to 140, you can go up to 3 large larvae per sweep. And if it's lower than 150, you can go 4 of these larvae, large larvae per sweep. And again, this, as I said, this is this large larva, not any of the smaller one. We did a lot of correlation between the population of like the small larvae, the mix of large and small, even the adult, and the yield, and we couldn't find the correlation that predict the relationship between the yield and this population, except for this large larva here. Because we have we just showed you on this table just one only one of the scenarios of the relationship between these 3 factors: the price of hay per ton, the cost of application, and the population of large larvae. There is a lot of combination here. So we developed like an app or like a website here. This is here the website that you can visit. And it's just like, as from the name, it's a Weevil calculator. This is a snapshot of it. The first factor here that you put is the price of hay as dollar per ton. And here, like for the purpose here, we fixed it as 200. This is this circle here, you can like slit it on a bar here and it will give you a range of the price of hay. But here, let's say it's 200, and your cost of treatment per dollar here, we put it at $29, and it will give you that if you found an average of 2.5 large larvae per 180 sweep, that justify an application or treatment for your field here. And you can like change these numbers as you can see fit, and it will give you your prediction here of the population that that you can see it all the time. With this, it's lower threshold than what we have been using before, or not using, but at least know about before, of the 15 to 20. Some come and say, oh, does that mean we'll spray more if we have like these? And we try to find out ways of getting answer for this. And we did a couple of treatments here to see if we can act early, the timing of the application, and whether that would help mitigate the population of this larvae or this alfalfa weevil early on, and we don't need much application afterward. And it sounds like it works. Here we have, this is one of two trials that we did from 2018 to 2020. This is here, we went really early on with an early insecticide application. Once we found it was almost about 1 larva per sweep. That's when we found the average that we found it. And you can see like all the application here are getting, quite small accumulative alfalfa weevil larva, even, 44 days after the application. So it seems like early treatment when you have very small larval population, and you are treating them, you are getting them under control. You don't, overwhelm the insecticide that you have with a lot of larval activity. On the other hand, if you just let it go and you are late, here we have in the same season, we applied late insecticide application in March, and the population was quite high. We were almost reaching about 9 large larvae per sweep. Here, when you don't have much control on this population, yeah, we have, you know, some of the insecticide really will put them at 4, maybe 4.5 here, accumulatively of the larval population per sweep, but that's a lot for this insect to not making damage. It's still having damage. It's not as you can get when you have this untreated here with almost like 21 larva bear sweep, but you still have some losing the yield here. So you need to act early when you have this population, and you need to act with some insecticides that work. And we have some of these insecticides that's working here. Thing is, make sure that if you will need another application later on, you change, you know, the group of chemicals so we can like delay or manage the resistance here. One of the things that we found like last year in 2020 is we have an influx in the population of these large or of these larvae. Like this is here, some of the larvae that I collected out. That was, I think that was in early March 2020, and I was going to give a presentation in La Paz County in Parker, and in the road I just collected, you know, few of these. I visited one field close by there and just collected few samples, and from 5 sweeps, that's what I found, and that's too much. It's 189 larvae per 5 sweeps, and that's, you know, an average of 37.8 per 1 sweep. That's quite a lot. And for this specific field, I know they tried to treat them 2 times, and it didn't work. Again, because they started or applied their application quite late, and there was an overwhelming population that no insecticide would like impact or like get them to a level that will not make damage. So that's a message here that we are trying to get to people, especially with this weevil, is that you try to get early and try to get with the right insecticide. We have you know, some resistance of some of this insecticide, especially some of the pyrethroids, and we are losing some in our arsenal, but we are also having some other insecticides that we are using, and even like some in the pipeline that we are testing for like 2 years now, and showed very good results. So for like this year, we just finished this trial of efficacy trial, and we didn't finalize the analysis of the data yet, but I just want to give you an idea about the treatment that we had. And after this slide, we'll show you short video of, you know, the plot that we have at MAC and how the contrast between all the treatment and the untreated is quite important here. But this is some of the insecticides that we are using. We have one like still experimental product. I cannot talk about it much, but we are testing 3 rates of this product. Plus, we have some of the chemicals that we are using for some time, like Chlorspan Advanced, Warrior, Stewart, Cobalt Advanced, Besiege, Turac, and Turac plus Exponent. This is like more of like adjuvant. 3 rates of delegate and the untreated check. And I should tell you, like this year and year before, and even like since I started here, I cannot see in the central area of the state that much resistance. Yeah, we have a pocket or like something like that, very localized area, but there is not much resistance for much of these product here. Most of them are from area along the Colorado River, and we saw that like since last year, I should say, or even the year before, and also in some areas in California and in the north part of California also, it's quite concerning about the level of resistance there. And it showed also in the desert area and low desert area in California. So this might be a future for, not a good one, but the future for our area here in Central and South Arizona. So we need to be vigilant in terms of what we are doing, and we need to be a good steward of these chemistries, and we need to delay this resistance as much as we can. So I don't know if we have any questions so far about that, but I'll continue on with the other pests that we are going to talk about today, which is the mites in silage corn in Arizona. Mostly what we are talking about here is the two-spot spider mite. And this is here just picture that we took for the mite itself on corn leaf, and this like burl surface here, this is the eggs of these mite, and you have the adult here, and also you have some of what we call their larvae or like nymphs here. This is the damage mostly like happening. It's like this mite or just suck the sap of these leaflets, leave them with that much damage on the leaflet, become low quality. It could reduce the yield as well, and that's when you can see it in terms of when you are harvesting. You have a lot of this very lightweight leaflet that just doesn't make it into the truck, and it lowers the quality a lot for corn. There are many factors here in our desert area that encourages the spider mite population to increase. One of them, like we cannot control much of it, is dust. The little particles of dust, like this little sand, it will show some of the or become like some of like a sticking point for the mite, and will encourage the population to settle and increase in some areas of the plant. Water stress play a very big role. Like this pest or this arthropods, this mite can recognize plants that are water stressed, and they will attack them. And if you delay some of the irrigation, you might encourage the colony to spread in your field. Weed also is working as an alternative host for these mites, and it can encourage the population to increase in your field. So clean field without much of the weed is quite good for managing this mite. The other thing that we did, again, we have some of these efficacies over the years for spider mite. We established like a lot of plots for corn, like this one here, silage corn, and we spray ground spraying some of these with different miticide. And for the efficacy, we do that at MAC over the years, and I will share with you like some of these studies that we did since 2014 until like 2019. This is here like one of these results that we have for over the year from 2014 to 19. This effect of different miticide on the number of motile. This is like all of the nymph and the adult of spider mite, and you can see like it's almost, if you look at like this first at this yellow column here, this is the untreated, and it's almost like an alternative year. You have year where you have lower population, then followed by year you have high, lower again, high and low and high again. So it seems like it's a year after year when we have this population in the corn. But if you look at the treatment that we have, and here we are having three of the like major miticides that we are using: Onager, Opron, and Zeal. If you look at them, they are like most of the year, they are giving really good control of this miticide compared to the untreated one. Except here in 2019, it was an odd year. We have very high population, very, very late in the season. Yeah, we have the population, but we didn't see that much damage because the window before harvest wasn't that much. The other thing here This is the same, insecticide over the same year, but for eggs. And again, you can see like the same trend, very high in terms of the untreated, but the miticide are doing a good job in managing them down, especially in the higher year, like in 2015 and 17 and some in 19. This is here the total of everything, the motile and the eggs, and it follows the same trend here. We are following this again, and we are doing, more extended study this year about the efficacy of miticides. Last year we couldn't do it because we couldn't find population. So hopefully this year is up here again, and we will find the population, and we'll conduct this efficacy study this year. So before we finish, I think we have this video about the trial that we have for the efficacy of Alfalfa Weevil that we would like to share with you. Kyle, can we share that? So this is here, like it would be like a drone footage or like video of one of the plot replications that we have, and we'll have the name of each treatment on each of these plots. You can like find each plot by changing the color of like this flag here. So this is here, like you can see, this is green, good looking alfalfa for some of the insecticides that we are using. And as I said, this is one of the replications that we have. And this year we tested 13 different treatments plus the untreated. So it's a good number of product and different rate of this product. As I said, like one of them is quite new, still in the pipeline. We cannot talk much about it. And we have different rate of a couple of these insecticide, plus the recommended rate for some of the insecticides that we are using for some time now. So that's here, like all the treatment. You might see this one, that coming one, it's a little bit different in terms of the color. It's like a little bit yellowish, and this one treated, and you can see the difference between like the yellow, this yellowish one and the green one that we saw before in terms of the difference, and that's mostly the impact of the feeding of the larva on this alfalfa. So with that, I'm done, and we'll be here with our next speaker, and our next speaker, Worko, are you here? You want to share your screen? Yeah, our next speaker will be Dr. Worko Pryor, and he will share with us some of his work on the enhancing alfalfa yield and yield components through balanced phosphorus and potassium management. Work with our research specialist for my program here, and he's conducting this research for some years now, and I'll leave it to you, Worko.
Thank you very much, Ayman, and good morning, everyone.
I think you are still muted.
Oh, still muted?
No, you're good. We can hear you.
Yeah, you can hear me, yeah?
Yeah.
Yeah, okay. So, good morning, everyone, and I'm going to present today enhancing alfalfa yield and yield components through balanced phosphorus and potassium management. Particularly, I'm going to talk on yield components of alfalfa and which yield components positively and significantly associated with alfalfa yield. The review I made, also the research we conducted here in Arizona. So what are the indicators of alfalfa yield, or those indicators of alfalfa yield? That means the components of alfalfa yield that affects the alfalfa. One of the components and indicators of alfalfa yield is live plants per area. This is the indicator most often used for alfalfa yield. For highly productive stand, a minimum of 15 to 8 newly stand, and also 4 to 5 for established field per square feet is mostly recommended. But research indicated that live plants per area correlation between plants per square foot and yield is actually rather low, since individual alfalfa plants respond to decreasing stand density by producing more stems. So the stems per plant is used also as an indicator of alfalfa yield, because an increase in stems per plant compensates for fewer plants and will often maintain yields. So stem per plant is also an indicator of alfalfa yield, particularly for 6 to 8 for newly stand and 4 to 7 for established is most usually recommended. And another one is maybe the best one as indicator of alfalfa is number of stems per square foot. In many cases, this can be a better indicator of a productive field, because it reflects the health and vigor of the plants. So fields with 50 to 60 for newly stands and 40 to 50 for established stands are most often used as a good indicator of alfalfa yield. Also, mass per shoot, the weight of shoot, is also an indicator of yield, because yield is a function of live plants per area, stem per plants, and mass per shoot. Other indicators are also uniformity of the stand. These factors to consider include the uniformity of the stand and the weed situation during visual assessment. The uniformity of the stand, particularly in its height and in its density, and the weed situation in that stand is indicators of alfalfa yield. If patchy areas are there, the density is very low per square feet, it is obvious that the field is not good and may be considered for replacement. Other indicators of alfalfa yield is plant age. So plant weight particularly be taken into consideration when determining the optimum harvest maturity. Most of the time 28 inches or between 26 to 30 inches is the height most probably wanted during cutting. We will see our condition of plant height during harvesting in a couple of slides to come. Internode length is also a good indicator of alfalfa yield, particularly internode length is an indicator of stressor, if there is water stress or any kind of stress or deficiency of some nutrients, the length of internode indicating those stresses. So it can be a good indicator of alfalfa yield. Or node number is also an indicator of alfalfa yield, because of the fact that it also inversely related to internode length. The good internode length is the less node number. The high node number is particularly the less internode length. So it indicates also the alfalfa yield, whether it is positive or negative. Trifolates of the alfalfa yield component is also particularly the 3 trifoliate first merged is an indicator of really very alfalfa yield. And there are others also indicators of alfalfa yield, which was not mentioned, but these are the main indicators of alfalfa yield. That's just why I mentioned here. And we determined also in our case in the field trial as well as in the tube trial. So these indicators help to answer the question, should I maintain my alfalfa yield or should I fertilize my alfalfa field? So these indicators of alfalfa yield is mainly affected by fertilizer we use, particularly if we use balanced fertilizer or single high application of phosphorus or another fertilizer. So with intensive alfalfa production system, like in our case, mostly growers increased input, especially P fertilizer rate to achieve higher yields. But research indicated that P and K interaction have positive impact on the agronomic performance of alfalfa. In our case, there is little information in the low desert on balanced PK fertilization, particularly effects on yield and the yield components of alfalfa. With this being the case, we conducted our field and tube trials with the objectives of to determine the impact of phosphorus and K nutrition on yield and yield components of alfalfa, also to determine which yield components are actually associated with changes in alfalfa forage yield, or which yield component is really positively correlated to alfalfa yield. Now, to meet these objectives, we follow the methodologies under field condition as well as in tube trial. Under field condition, we conducted 3x3 3 rates of phosphorus as well as 3 rates of potassium, and the combination is 9 treatment combination, both under field condition and in tube trial. But the soil condition is somewhat different. In the field trial at Mank, it is sandy clay loam, and its study in tube is sandy loam, where 72% of are sands. So with these methodologies, we got results that the fertilizer effect on field. This is the seed, 90% germination was planted during October. And after a week, we got almost 85% of emerging planting from the seed. Those emerging plants, after 3 months after planting, showed clear and significant differences between the unfertilized plot and fertilized plot. The unfertilized plot are thin and non-uniform and standard growth, but the fertilized plot, particularly with 125 phosphates and 100 potash, gave really uniform and high yields during the first cutting or 4 months after planting, and then collected some stems as well as plants and determined the number of shoots per plant or the number of stems per plant, and also determined the stored fungus, number of internode, as well as the height of the plants before harvesting. The significance of P and K and their interaction showed that phosphorus affected most of the yield components as well as yield itself. Yield, stem per plant, stem per square foot, mass per stem, height, and internal length highly affected by phosphorus. Plant per square foot is not affected because of the fact that we maintained plant per square foot constant for all treatments to reduce the effect of rate of seed effect on the plants or stems. So we maintained this, so there is no significant effects on those phosphorus and potassium or the interaction. But potassium individually has no significant effect on yield and yield components. Of this is expected because of the high potassium in the soil. But when phosphorus interacted with potassium, it follows, in fact, the trend of phosphorus, where the phosphorus and potassium interaction affected yield and yield components of alfalfa. So, including phosphorus and potassium together and keeping the balance between the two, P and K, have significant effects on yield and yield components of alfalfa in both soil types. PK interaction also affect on alfalfa yield and yield components. This is the interaction of phosphorus and potassium, or phosphate and potash. As we see from here, yield is highly significantly affected by potash and phosphorus, and also stem per plant, as well as internode language affected. But highly affected one is also when we increase the potassium kept equal phosphorus, particularly shoot per square foot and shoot per plant, significantly affected. So increasing potassium with phosphorus and balancing with it will increase, particularly shoot per square foot and shoot per plant. That should be considered when the plant population decreased per unit area. And the alfalfa yield components versus yield indicated that also the stem per plant significantly and positively correlated with the yield. But this stem per plant decreased after a certain point, while at peak around 9 stems per plant, giving about 1 pound per square foot of fresh yield, and also stem per square foot significantly and positively affected the yield, where it is really highly significant effect, and it is positive, but decreasing after a stem point when it reached around 59 stems per square foot area. So, and the mass stem is linearly increasing actually the yield, so it's significantly and positively affecting the yield of alfalfa. And plant height also affected significantly and positively the yield. Around 28 inches of plant height gave maximum yield in this case, and also the internal length of about 2.2 inches internal length gave the highest or maximum yield in our case. So when we see the yield component versus yield increases were due to higher number of stems per plant, that is with correlation of 80%, and stems per square foot with correlation of 83%, greater mass per shoot with correlation of 81%, and plant height with 80%, while some less with internal length, it is 69%. So in our present findings, we estimated 9 stems per plant, 59 shoot per square foot, 8 pounds per shoot, the height of 29 inches, and 2.2 inches internal length produced the highest yield. Individually, P and K increased also yield, particularly if you see this phosphorus in 2018-2019 at MAC increased 8 to 8.2 in 2018 and 6.5 to 7.6 in 2019. In tube trial, this become higher, is 22 or 23% to 28% in 2019 and 25.65 to 33% in 2020. A slight increase was also obtained from potassium at MAC as well as in the tube trial, but the increment is really increasing potassium from 100 to 300 has no yield advantages when we see individually. So 100 gives higher yield than the 300, both in tube trial as well as in MAC. In tube trial, even 9 in 2020% yield increase obtained as compared to only 1% yield increase when we apply 300 K2O, pound is K2O. The combination is more increased yield. This is the average of 2 years at MAC. Any kinds of increment can be obtained by balancing the fertilizer rate, particularly at 125 PTO5 and 100 K2O, 13% of yield increment was obtained. And also in tube trial, the trend is similar, but the higher percentage of yield increase obtained at the say 125 and 100 combination, which is about 42% yield increment. When we see this balanced fertility, we had some synergetic effect. When we see the yield advantage, the PK over unfertilized for both years, and the average is 30.5 yield advantage over unfertilized plot if we use the PK balanced fertilizer application. This is 8.35 yield advantage when over K alone, or 4.95 average of 2 years yield advantage over P alone. But when we see the PK interaction over individual P plus individual K divided by 2, the average of the two, we got 5.92 yield advantage in 2018, and we got 7.28% yield advantage in 2019. So as we go from the first year to the second year, the yield advantage become more pronounced with 6.6% increment over our average. This become higher in tube trial, which is particularly when you see this 22% in 2019 and increasing 5% in 26% in PK over P plus K over 2, which is with an average of 24.07% of yield increase. We want to show also the nutrient amount removed and the amount of required to give the maximum yields in our case. The research indicated that PTO5, the amount removed pounds per ton of alfalfa is about 15. This time, particularly, the update of the research indicated that also potash 60 pounds per ton removed from the field. That means the amount removed at 15 tons per hectare, the 15 tons per hectare is the maximum yield we obtained at sandy clay loam at MAC, and 17 tons per hectare maximum yield was obtained on sandy loam in tube trial. So the maximum, at maximum 15 tons per hectare, about 225 phosphate and about 900 potash pounds per acre removed from the soil. This is an estimation based on the 50 tons per hectare. But our extractable nutrient from the soil samples indicated that we extracted about 3 pounds per acre, or about 6.4 ppm, and about 771 pounds per acre, or about 320 ppm extractable potash. So when we see this, the amount required become, by simple calculation, it is about 195 pounds phosphate per acre and 129 KTO. But we applied based on 8.3 tons per acre. So our PTO5 is 0, 100, and 125 rates based on actually on 8.3 average tons per acre that is easily obtained in Arizona. So that's why it's less when you compare it individually when we see it. So the KTO is also 0, 100, and 300 based on this calculation. But we got maximum yield at 125 PTO5 and 100 KTO PK combination, as we saw from our yield result. So combination of fertilizer in this case indicates that we can reduce the amount of fertilizer applied by optimizing or balancing the fertilizer application of P and the K. The same trend was obtained for 17 tons per hectare as sandy loam soil, where 125 and 100 also give the highest yield. So balanced fertilizer application improved alfalfa yield, and the maximum yield obtained at 125 PTO5 and 100 KTO on both soil types. So to give some summary of this, P and K interaction has significant and also positive effect on yield and the yield components of alfalfa. The balanced PK particularly produced the highest productivity at 125 pounds PTO5 and 100 pounds KTO. P has significant individually, while K has slight effect on yield effect. But the highest single P or K fertilizer alone did not result in significantly increased yield. Individually, P, the highest rate of P is not significantly different from the lower rate. I mean, from 100 PTO5 as well as 125 PTO5 gave the same result statistically. So a conservative approach to identifying fertilizer application rate may be more profitable, and additional research and detailed economic analysis is required. Thank you. If you have a question, I would love to answer it. So back to you, Ayman. Thank you.
Thank you, Orko. Appreciate it. And again, if you have any question, please write them in the chat box. I think we have a question here from Steve, and he's in the chat box, and he's asking, how is extractable nutrients different than amount removed? Please define. Orko?
Okay. The one I saw, the amount removed, is the calculated one, not exactly extractable one. Based on the maximum yield, 15 tons per hectare, we simply calculated 15 tons per hectare can remove from the soil based on the yield expected. But the extractable nutrient is the one we extracted from soil samples, and taking soil samples and determined the amount the soil has it. So the simple calculation based on the yield as well as the actual that we got from the field through soil sample.
Okay, and we have another question here from Dan. Did you get very high K uptake in your high K treatment? What is the implication of key concentration in the plant?
This is really a very good question. We get the we didn't get high uptake in our K treatments, but in plant concentration, it is between under field condition at MAC, it is between 2 to 2.8%, but in tube trial, it is about 2.2 to 3% in plant. And understand the luxurious consumption of potassium have effect on livestock, but in this case, actually, I didn't see more than 3% in the plant, the one we determined from plant tissue samples. So that is the range we obtained.
And Worko, here I want to also mention, you think soil type also has an impact because we have differences in terms of the soil types here between what we have at MAC and the tube ones?
Yes, of course. As we see, the tube trial more responsive than the at MAC because the tube trial is 72% sand. So it can be said that the more sandy soil is more responsive than the sandy clay loam at MAC. So as I said, individually, when we see the potassium, there is no significant differences between the three treatments. So has no significant effect or yield components. But when it is interact with phosphorus, that shows phosphorus has positive effect for potassium efficiency. So the interaction has good response when we see on sandy loam soils than sandy clay loam soil. So the research also indicated that the soil differences has impact on the response of alfalfa to the potassium application or the balanced fertilizer application.
Okay, thank you, Worko. And I think we'll move forward with the next presentation, next speaker, Mike Ottman with the University of Arizona. He's our agronomic specialist, and he will discuss dynamic of triticale growth and quality during the season. Mike, you want to share your screen? Yeah.
Yes. Let's see how this goes here. Okay. Can you see my screen?
No. And we can't see your face either.
Well, I did that on purpose.
There you
How
go.
about that?
Sharing, yeah.
Much better.
Yeah, I recognize your voice, Dan.
I thought I was disguising it.
Yeah. Well, so you can see my screen now.
Yeah, you need to put it on the.
Yeah, I will. And so I just want to spare you from seeing my face. So I'll just show the screen. So is it okay to start, Ayman?
Yes, go ahead.
Okay. So as Ayman said, I'm going to be talking about the dynamics of triticale growth and quality during the season. And my name's Michael Ottman. I'm an extension agronomist at the University of Arizona. And my my collaborator on this work is Wayne Koblenz. He's a research leader, agronomist, and a dairy nutritionist at the U.S. Dairy Forage Research Center in Marshfield, Wisconsin. So what is triticale? Triticale is one of the winter cereals, such as barley, oats, rye, and wheat. It's actually a man-made hybrid of rye and wheat. It was, I think the first hybridization was done in England or in Scotland and Germany in around 1875. So this crop has been around for a while, not as long as wheat. I mean, wheat's been around for 10,000 years. But it's used primarily for forage, at least in Arizona and in many other areas, but it can also be used as a grain crop. So triticale has the similar growth stages to wheat and barley. And you see this graphic, it's, starts out in the seedling stage and then develops tillers. And so at the tillering stage, it's essentially a bundle of leaves. And then it goes to this jointing stem extension stage. I'll call this the rapid growth stage, and then to boot. And typically for forage, the triticale would be harvested at the boot stage for highest quality. And then you can see these are major stages. We're skipping some stages. It goes on to flower, and then soft dough might be the stage where you would have highest yield. You know, then of course it goes to maturity for grain harvest, and obviously for the purposes of forages, you would never take it probably past the soft dough stage. So we did a study with triticale at the Maricopa Ag Center. It was planted in the middle of December 2019, and there are actually 14 varieties of triticale. And we measured yield and quality at 7 harvest dates that were spaced roughly 2 weeks apart. And for the purposes of this talk, I'm not going to talk about any differences amongst the varieties. What I'll just show is the average of the varieties over time. And that's really the point of my talk, is to show the dynamics. And so if you look at the forage yield over time, here we go from, you know, it was planted in mid-December, as I said, and if you go from tillering, from February, we're at about the tillering stage, and then we go through to the beginning of June, you see this S-shaped curve, but this is a typical sigmoidal or S-shaped growth curve that you see with most crops. And one thing you might notice is that there's this lag stage up until basically maybe around March 1 till you get to early jointing. You have a rapid growth stage where the growth is fairly linear. And then you have a plateau stage starting around soft dough. And actually from soft dough to maturity, you may actually have some loss in yield. And so you can see the major growth stages. And one thing I like to point out is at the boot stage, you have about half of the forage yield as you do at the soft dough stage. This is forage yield in tons per acre at 72% moisture. The other thing I think that's interesting is if you look at the growth rate in tons per acre per day, it has actually a tremendous growth rate when you think about it. From March until maybe the first part of May, the crop is putting on somewhere from 0.2 to maybe 0.35 tons per acre per day. And so in a week time, that could be 2 tons per week at the highest growth rate. You know, highest growth rate is at heading, and so that's a tremendous growth rate. And I show this to show that any you know, the longer you wait, the higher the yield. The problem, of course, is the decline in quality over time, and that's what I'll show next. And so one thing we did, I'm showing you this slide is the percent of leaf, stem, and head in the forage as a percentage of the total. And so it's not, again, I must say, it's not the total, it's not a absolute amount, it's a relative amount. And so at the tillering stage, basically you have a bundle of leaves that you can see here. And it's 100% leaves. And then you can see over time, the leaves decrease until soft dough stage, for example, might be say 15 to 20% of the total. And the reason this is important is the leaves are very, very digestible. But when you look at the stems, the proportion of stems increases steadily over time until about the boot stage, actually. And the stems are probably the least digestible component. And you see the stems at the boot stage make up about 60% of the total and the total weight, and the leaves are at 40%. The wild card in this whole thing is the grain, or what we did. We didn't measure the grain, but we measured the head. I estimate the head is probably 80 to 90% grain, and the rest is chaff and the rachis and other parts. So in the head it was the reason we measured the head is because it was very difficult to separate the grains, and so the head is really a substitute measurement for grain. But if you look at the proportion of the head and for the total weight, it just increases with time, and it is more digestible because it's basically carbohydrates, easily digestible carbohydrates. And you see over time, when you get to the soft dough stage, it's you might have close to 50% of the weight is in the head, and then the rest is between the stem and the leaves. So if you look at crude protein, early on at the early jointing stage, the crude protein of the Triticale is actually pretty good. It's if you compare it to alfalfa, it might be similar to alfalfa. But one thing about crude protein is that it decreases probably more than any other quality component. And so you could see at the early jointing stage, it might be 22%. By the time you get to soft dough stage, the crude protein might be 8%. And so that's a tremendous decline. And you'll see in future slides with fiber and some other components that nothing really declines as fast as crude protein. And so obviously crude protein at the boot stage at 16% might be a poor to moderate source of protein in Triticale. Once you get to the soft dough stage, it's really a poor source of protein. But what I may say is that Triticale is not necessarily grown for the protein, but is grown as a source of digestible fiber, which I'll show in the slide after this. But first, I want to show TDN and NEL. TDN is total digestible nutrients, and then the NEL is net energy of lactation. And the reason I put both of these on there is most farmers might be familiar with TDN. It's really, sometimes hay is bought and sold on TDN. And you can see over time that the TDN decreases over time, and so does the net energy of lactation. And both of these are measures of energy available to the animal. And you can see in the case of TDN, and that's the blue line, close to, at the early jointing stage, close to 80% of the forage is digestible in some way or another. Things that might be undigestible are things such as ash, and there's fiber, some types of fiber that are indigestible. So if you look at the boot stage, just as an example, it might be 65% total digestible nutrients. And then you go down to the soft dough stage, and it might be 55%. So this is showing fiber, and as I said, there's different ways to measure fiber. And what I'm showing is NDF, which is neutral detergent fiber, which is the blue line. And you can see over time that the fiber, the neutral detergent fiber pretty much increases, which is bad for quality. You want as low fiber as possible. And you can see probably about the heading stage that the NDF kind of plateaus. But one thing this slide shows is the NDF-D and 30. And the NDF, what that means is the amount of the neutral detergent fiber that's digestible after 30 hours. And so one thing that happens as the plant matures, if you look from heading on, you have the same amount of fiber as measured by NDF, but the fiber that you do have is becoming less digestible. And that's why a lot of our quality measurements aren't necessarily an indicator of plant performance. This MDFD has been around for some time, but not for a long time. And this is probably, at least for the dairyman, a very important measurement. And the reason the fibers becomes less digestible over time is there's certain components which increase in the stem over time, such as lignin, just as an example. You'll have more lignin, and so that fiber, even though you have the same amount of fiber, say from heading to maturity, you have a higher proportion of lignin and other undigestible types of fiber. So if you were to look at milk per ton and milk per acre, but I need to pause for just a minute. These were both estimated using a program from the University of Wisconsin called Milk 2016 for grasses and alfalfa. They have one for corn silage, and I think you can also use it for sorghum silage. It's a little bit different. And this is I might say, is more of a thought experiment or theoretical calculation, because in this, you're assuming that all the forage you're feeding to the cow is the triticale. I could have put in an assumption that it's half triticale, half corn silage, but in this particular case, I assume that just so for comparative purposes, what is the milk value of triticale? And so you could see, if you look at milk per ton, it decreases over time, but it plateaus around heading. And so at heading time, you have the less digestible, the stems are less digestible, but you got the grain coming on that's more digestible. So you kind of get this plateau here. If you look at milk per acre, it just keeps increasing. The milk per acre actually is driven primarily by yield. And so this is your linear yield increase. And so you get, roughly comparing the boot stage to the soft dough stage, you get almost a doubling of milk per acre, almost a doubling of yield, and primarily because your yield's increasing, but your milk production per ton remains about the same. So in conclusion, if you look at triticale from early jointing to soft dough, the yield increases linearly, quality decreases, but then levels off near heading. And then after heading, there's no advantage to cut sooner than soft dough, because quality doesn't change much and yield is not maximized until soft dough. So with that, I will stop and answer any questions if there's time, or through the chat window, I could also do that once my talk is over. So thank you very much.
Thank you, Mike. And again, if you have any question for Mike or any other presenter, please do so in the chat box or communicate with them directly. We'll move forward with our next speaker, Dan Putnam, Dan Extension Agronomist and Forage Specialist with University of California, Davis. And Dan has his a lot of work on alfalfa and forage crops. And today he will discuss with us salinity and drought strategies for alfalfa. Dan, if you would like to share your screen, it's all yours now.
Okay, thanks a lot, Ayman. I will show my mug here for all of you to see. If it becomes a problem, let me know. If you're irritated, I can turn it off. So with that, I'm going to get started here. Today, my co-author is Umair Gul, who is a graduate student here at UC Davis, and we're going to talk a little bit about alfalfa production strategies under drought and salinity stress. I think we're all aware that we may be facing this year, but the question here is, can we produce alfalfa with about half as much water or under saline conditions? And how can we sustain forage production under severe water challenges that we're facing pretty much everywhere in the West, but particularly the Southwest, Arizona, California, New Mexico, Colorado? All of them are facing fairly substantial drought conditions even this year, and periodically from year to year. Irrigated alfalfa is really about 45 to 50% of U.S. alfalfa production in irrigated regions. And for those of you who are not familiar, alfalfa is the third most important economic crop in the United States, and it's often the #1 water user in Western states, or number 2 or 3. Here in California, almonds are probably a bigger water user, but historically, alfalfa has been the #1 water user in California. The acreage is low enough now, so it's the tree crops that are a bigger water user right now. For those of you, this is a refresher from your training. Hopefully it's a refresher that water is the driving force for plant growth, and we shouldn't forget that. It's in order for plant growth to proceed, the stomates on the underneath of the leaves have to be open for CO2, carbon, to enter the leaves and be fixed by photosynthesis, so that the plant can produce sugars and other kinds of compounds in the plant. And without turgor pressure, or the water pressure from the soil through the plant and into the atmosphere, the evaporation of water from the leaves, the stomates close and you cannot have carbon coming into the plant. And so the moment that you get basically wilting of the plant leaves, you're going to get a cessation of growth and cessation of yield development and photosynthesis, or at least a reduction of that. And so turgor pressure is so important to growth, and we shouldn't forget that. And for those of you who remember this from your Agronomy 101, yield is a function of many different factors. We talked about insect control today, and soil factors of phosphorus and potassium, which are all very important. But if water is not there, if that's the most limiting factor, your yields are going to be lower than because of that factor. Improper, I'd have to say that improper irrigation, that is deficits or excess, lack of uniformity, limits alfalfa yields more often to a greater extent than any other management factor in Western states, and actually to a considerable degree in other regions as well. But what do you do when you just don't have enough? And so this is kind of the subject for today. The principle here is that we want more crop per drop, or certainly as much crop per drop as possible. And under a water limited year, this is going to be a very large challenge. This is the current status of the Western United States in terms of drought. The Pacific Northwest is in much better shape, but you look at the southwestern states, particularly your state of Arizona and New Mexico, Colorado, Utah, Nevada, and California. Other than the coastal part of California where we don't produce alfalfa, we're having pretty substantial drought conditions here. We do have some reservoirs that are still full, but most of our production areas are going to be severely limited this year with water. This is showing you the early 2021 progress here. This is the water demand for alfalfa, about 300 millimeters, and the rainfall that we received since October of last year was about a third of what's needed for even the winter growth of the alfalfa in the Central Valley of California. One of the things that we have to realize is that we have not only a supply and rainfall problem from surface waters, but we also have a groundwater problem. In the southern San Joaquin Valley, we've seen declines in groundwater availability over many years. We're in much better shape in the Sacramento Valley and the northern part of the San Joaquin Valley, but in the southern San Joaquin Valley, we're having tremendous problems of decline in groundwater resources, and this is going to be a big challenge as we go from this year through the future, particularly now that we have new laws that are restricting the decline of our groundwater resources. And during drought years, when we always see a significant decline in these groundwater resources in the Central Valley during those drought years, and it it actually doesn't recover adequately in those areas. And some areas we do see recovery, but in other areas we don't. And this is really one of the big worries of looking at a drought year. So what are our strategies for a drought year in alfalfa? Well, one of the options is, of course, to curl up in a ball and stop farming, which, of course, is not a very attractive option. We can shift crops. We can look at short season winter crops. Triticale, which my colleague Mike just talked about, is a really good winter option, much lower in its water impact. Partial season irrigations, that is irrigating less than the total requirement for the crop, in which case we can do gradual deficits or what we call cold turkey cutoffs in mid-season, and we'll examine that in a little bit more detail. The use of degraded water is another option. Remember, there's no such thing as dryland farming of any type. Even cacti requires some water, but rain-fed and residual moisture production is feasible of alfalfa, and this is the kind of thing we need to examine. Can we produce alfalfa on 1/2 the water? Well, let's examine that a little bit more. I did a drought a couple of years ago that says alfalfa is the best crop to have in a drought, and the reason for this is the water use efficiencies of that crop are much higher than other crops. It has deep roots. It can recover moisture from deep in the profile. It's a perennial, so it starts early. You don't have to irrigate up a seedling, and they can use residual moisture as a result. We can also successfully dry down alfalfa and still have economic returns. It recovers usually, not always, but recovers usually very nicely from that kind of dry down. And we can also accept degraded water, that is saline and wastewater. And so it offers a high degree of flexibility as compared with some crops. We certainly cannot deficit irrigate our other crops the same way we can deficit irrigate alfalfa. So this is an example of that. This is after 2 years of deficit summer irrigations at Westside Field Station in Fresno County under saline conditions in 2013 and 2014. Other than the gopher damage, these crops recovered quite nicely after a rewatering in the fall of 2014. So suggestions for a drought year. We think that alfalfa can be deficit irrigated, but partial yields should be expected. And the key issue there is to fill the profile in early spring. That's when the production is the highest in the early part of the year and the ET is the lowest early in the year. And then to curtail irrigation in mid into late summer periods, and to refill the profile in the early spring if water becomes available at that time. The idea here is that the ET of this crop is maximum during the period of June through September, and yet the production is not really maximized during that time. It's maximized earlier, and that's true regardless of what production system you're in. We can see 50 to 60% of production by, say, midsummer periods. And the water use efficiency in those early cuttings is much higher than later in the year. So here's some data that supports that concept. This is a study that was done in the 80s with either 2 irrigations per cutting, 1 irrigation per cut, summer skipping, that is in July and August, and rewatering in the fall, and then a complete termination in July for 2 years of production. You can see there's certainly a yield decline that takes place, but you still have some production even on the most severe deficit irrigation projects or strategies. And then in the last year of the study, when they rewatered all of the plots this is the 1980 study, everything recovered to normal yields that year. Now, how much water did they save in this case? Well, the irrigation water under the normal conditions was about 37 inches, and in the most severe termination trials, they were able to reduce it down to about one half the application, which resulted in about 29 inches of total available rainfall. in that particular trial. This was reported in a number of years ago. We've done some more recent studies on this, looking at different varieties, fall dormancy 4 through 8 at UC Davis, with different irrigation treatments, either full EC, ET supply, 75% of full watering, 75%. And in this case, we cut off in early August completely. And in this case, we watered fully early, but then 50% after about July, early July. And so these are two different 75% treatments. And in the case of the last treatment was 50% of the full ET, that is sudden cold turkey cutoff after the cutting in July. So this is what the crop looked like before we started the treatments. You can see here the watering, this is ETO. The ET of the crop is estimated about 85% with a K value of 85% at about 40 inches of water requirement. This is under drip irrigation, so you can see we're following ET fairly precisely during this period of time. In the case of the August cutoffs, we were at about 29 to 30 inches of water. Whether we did it as a gradual application or as a sudden cutoff. And in the case of the 50% treatment, we went down to about 19 inches of applied water. So what were the results here? Well, in the 75% treatments, we were about 95 to 96% of the full ET treatments, and in the 50% treatment, we were about at 80% of full yields under these conditions. So even though we were looking at about half the amount of water, we're still able to produce about, of applied water, produce about 80% of full yields. These are under good soils, I have to add, with excellent water holding capacity. So you would probably not expect this on a better drained soil that had poor water holding capacity. Part of the reason that this is feasible is that basically you have most of your yield comes up in that first 3 to 4, maybe 5 cuttings of the year. The yields are much lower in any event, even under fully watered conditions late in the season. And this is part of the reason that this is really feasible for alfalfa, where you would not see this for other types of crops. We looked at the importance of variety. We had 15 varieties in this. The highest yielding varieties under full irrigation tended to be the highest yielding under the deficits. So there was no interaction between the variety and the irrigation treatments. And therefore, we could not come to any real definite conclusion about some advantages of different varieties. There were some varieties that seemed to do a little bit better with stand survival after these water stress conditions. So this is what the crop looked like after this period of time. Now these look a little bit sorry here. These are the fully irrigated ones. These are the most severe deficits, but if you look closely, there actually is a fairly good stand here, even under the most severe conditions, and that crop recovered the following year. We've been working over a number of different areas in growers' fields and have found the same kind of result, that you can deficit irrigate the crop from say mid-June, July, all the way through the end of the year. One of the reasons, again, in all locations, about 60% of the yields of these crops are produced by mid-July. So we can look at 60 to 70% of full yields at least by irrigating up through that period of time. The same is true of the Arizona. This is Mike Ottman's graph showing the yield summer slump, or the lack of full yields later in the season that are almost half as much as they are in the early part of the season. That's part of the reason this works. Now we tried that, we wanted to look at this again this year, and so we started with Umair Gul, looking at his trial here at Davis, which was deficit irrigated on some parts of the field under sprinkler systems and mobile drip irrigation. And we divided that into either early season irrigation, that is irrigating in February, or no early irrigation. And so we're observing these crops this year to see how they do. And he's taken drone flights. You can see the tremendous advantage of this early irrigation regrowth, and we can see it visually in the field as opposed to parts of the field that were not irrigated in February of this year. I'll point out here that some of these crops are doing a little bit better that were actually fully irrigated the previous year. So we do have treatments in there like that. The soil moisture monitoring shows you that you can see here how much depletion in the soils that we've seen. This is the crop that was previous year was fully irrigated. So there's some residual moisture down there about 6 feet down, but a lot of a depletion here in the, say, the top 2 to 3 foot level. And when we irrigated, we brought all of that up to a much more adequate situation. This is the rainfall contribution. You can see the rainfall contribution here was fairly minimal, did not penetrate anywhere past, say, 12 inches. And in the crops where it was really deficit irrigated in the year before, you can see here the tremendous dry down. This is all very, very dry down here in the subsurface down about from 2 to 5 feet down. It's really way too dry. And one early irrigation brought up most of that field, and we're going to do a second irrigation here that will bring it up to field capacity, hopefully at the first cutting. Another trial that we've been doing at Kearney under sandier conditions, we had either previous year deficits compared with fully irrigated trials. So this is the red is the previous year deficit, and then the full, these were crops that were irrigated the previous year under full conditions. And then we had either winter flooding or no winter flooding. So this is no winter flooding and this is winter flooding. And you can see here that regardless of whether the previous year was under deficit, there was a real advantage to a winter flooding treatment. And this trial was actually designed to recharge the aquifer. So we put on actually 12 acre feet or greater onto these sandier soils in an attempt to recharge the aquifer, and it did not damage the alfalfa. In fact, there was a benefit from that winter flooding, and we monitored for oxygen, which is really the biggest problem under winter flooding conditions. So there's a contribution to the aquifer and as well as filling the profile. So strategies for water short years: water early, fill that profile, produce high quality, high yields crops early, continue to full production as long as possible with 2 to 5 cuts out of the total. Late summer and fall dry downs, and save on late season machine and pest management costs, but we have to accept reduced yields over the year. This is an example of a grower who is doing this down in Buttonwillow in the southern San Joaquin Valley, where they're flood irrigating. This is actually a drip irrigated field, but they're flood irrigating it in the winter period, actually with a mix of manure water and fresh water to fill that profile at the very beginning of the year, particularly in a dry year that we've had like this year. What about salinity? I'm going to try to quickly go through this. Salinity is really a long-term problem for all water challenged areas, and we need to have both soil and management strategies and possibly variety strategies. Alfalfa has been listed actually as a moderately sensitive crop, but I've come to disagree with this categorization by the FAO. We think it's actually fairly resilient to high salinity levels if you can get the crop established. And Australian data actually agrees with this. They're showing that at moderate salinity levels, in particular, it may be even superior to some of our other saline tolerant crops, with the exception of high salinity with tall wheatgrass, which seems to be, and salt bush, of course, which are very saline tolerant. This is some work that Sharon Bennis at Fresno State has done, showing the differences between varieties that appear at about 10 decisiemens per meter. You can see some declines in yields. This is in greenhouse studies, but you still get some forage yields out of these crops, even at 10 decisiemens per meter. This is some work out of Riverside, California with, if you can follow this, this is at 8 decisiemens per meter, sort of a really a high salinity under sand tank conditions. But almost all of the crops here showed tolerance at that level. It's not until you get up to about 13 decisiemens per meter that you start to get some yield declines of the different varieties that they tested under sand tank conditions. And then of course, as you get into about 24 decisiemens per meter, then you get much more severe declines, but of course the crop still survives, at least for the most part, under those conditions. It had less effect on roots than in shoots. We saw about a 77% of full and 50% and 27% of full under these 3 salinity conditions. We've done some field trials in the last 4 years on high salinity conditions with alfalfa varieties, and you can see here the high and low salinity conditions with an aerial photograph. This is a yield map showing the differences between the 2 different types, and this is a thermal map, and the more intense blue shows a better growth pattern in the low salinity groups in year 3. This is a listing of different varieties. We had about, in the first year, only a 4% decline with high salinity, but then as the crop matured, it was closer to 18 to 22% salinity effects on the yield. That is, the yield losses were about 20% under those conditions. But what I wanted to point out here is that actually the average yield under these conditions is actually quite respectable and economically viable for alfalfa production in Fresno County, California. Average over the 3 years, first 3 years was about 18%. And these were where we watered the crop with EC water of about 8 to 11, and the soil ECs range from about 10 to 16 decisiemens per meter by the 3rd year of production. What were the differences between the varieties? Well, there were some varieties that did quite well under low salinity, but also did well under high salinity conditions, and those are the ones that we really want to pay some attention to. So these varieties here, and you can see that we have this posted on our website. We do have some varieties that did poorly under both high and low conditions, and so those were varieties that we probably want to avoid for saline production situations. But we did not have, similar to our other trial, we did not have an interaction between salinity and varieties in this trial, and we had 35 varieties in this trial. One of the key things about salinity is that soil factors are probably going to be more important than salinity itself. That is, the effects on the soil causing standing water, lack of infiltration, that is no deep moisture, soil crusts are going to be pretty important, more important, I think, than actually the salinity itself. The salinity causes these soil problems of lack of drainage, and so things like deep ripping and making sure you have good drainage, soil amendments to try to address particularly the high SIR, high sodium types of situations are probably pretty important. And the stand establishment process, if you can at all use fresh water for that and pay lots of attention to that issue, I think are important. These were all done, these trials were all done under a fully established crop. After it had been established, it can take a lot of salinity, but seedling alfalfa is really difficult to go through these crusts and to deal with standing water. So in conclusion, how to survive these low water years? Well, in my view, water early, fully, and with high yields and high quality harvest envisioned for at least the period of time that you have some water available to you. Look at late season cutoffs and cease production later in the year when water becomes less available. And hopefully winter recharge if you have surface water available during the late part of the season or the early spring and January, February, March. And that's the period that we want to try to do some winter recharge because there might be surface water available at that time. We need to look at more precise irrigation methods like drip, sprinklers, and mobile drip irrigation. It's likely to be helpful, but flooding is quite effective in my experience at filling profiles and getting that crop ready to start the season. So alfalfa really has excellent tolerance of high salinity conditions, and coupled with agronomic practices, I think we can control salinity when we have to deal with it, and also use degraded water in some cases to produce high quality alfalfa. So here's a few upcoming events. We're going to have a Western Alfalfa Symposium in 2021. I hope many of you will be interested in that. In the 2022, a World Alfalfa Congress down in San Diego, participation from many people around the world. And those of you who are interested, we have a blog on alfalfa. We just recently posted some things on that. So with that, I'll just open it up. I think Ayman, to questions.
Thank you, Dan. And again, if you have any question, you can chat directly with Dan on the chat box. You can just click on his name, and you can communicate the question directly to him, or you can just put them to everyone. And I believe Dan will be here and he can see them. I can see no question right now, but again, I know question rise once you think about all of this information that have been shared. That's okay, and you can ask this question at any time. Now we'll move with the next presentation is with Mike Crimmins. Mike is extension specialist of climate science with the University of Arizona. And today Mike will discuss with us some climate update and spring outlook. Mike.
Good morning, everybody. Can you hear me okay, Ayman?
Yes, I can hear you.
Okay, great. I'll get my camera on too here.
Good.
Okay, good morning, everybody. Thanks. And hopefully this will be helpful after Dan's talk about short water years. And unfortunately, I don't really have much good news. I think you probably already know the punchline to this talk, but we'll move through some information here, and hopefully there's something helpful in here. And so as Dan already showed, the US Drought Monitor it's pretty bleak. We're at epically bad drought here across much of the Southwest, and unfortunately it's encompassing much of the upper basin and both Arizona and New Mexico. So much of Arizona and New Mexico are actually at exceptional drought conditions, D4, and it's been an interesting path to get to these drought conditions, which we really haven't seen kind of at this extent with this combination of summer drought and winter drought on top of it. It's hard to remember, but just a year ago, a little over a year ago, when we were coming out of the end of 2019 into the beginning of 2020, we should have known, but the January of 21, much of the Southwest was drought free except for the upper basin and parts of Northeast Arizona, but much of California, Nevada, and Southern Arizona were actually drought free at that point. We had a pretty miserable monsoon in 2019, but we actually had a fairly wet fall into winter season, just fall of 2019, beginning of 2020. So we were largely drought free across the southern parts of Arizona, southern parts of Southwest. And it wasn't until we got to the monsoon season that we really started to see things slide. And so again, everybody remembers the monsoon here in Arizona proper didn't really show up. And so we quickly slid into some extreme drought conditions. And then by a year later, in January 19th in this map, 2021, we were into these exceptional drought conditions. And that it's moved around a little bit. And interestingly, the southwest part of the state, which is, doesn't get a lot of precipitation, ended up being one of the wetter spots of the whole Southwest, with a couple of events that moved through. But again, nothing that was drought breaking, and overall, the whole Southwest is still locked into these drought conditions. So looking at an April through March 12-month period, this puts us right to the end of last month. The precipitation percentiles were all in the bottom 10% of the historical record, 1895 through present. And you can see just little spots in there where they were record driest, but overall the whole region seeing much below normal precipitation. And on the temperature side, again, everybody's in the above normal top 10% of years. And then you can see a lot of those low desert areas are also at record warmest. And that was really just the screaming hot temperatures with the monsoon season and the precipitation not showing up really boosted the overall 12-month temperatures over this period. If we move forward and just look at the last 4 months, things have moderated quite a bit. December through March, not wet. And I guess I look at this as just a kind of a glass half full. It could have been a lot worse. And looking at a La Nina event that was forming in the summer and into the fall, we were kind of anticipating a dry winter coming up here. And I really think it could have been a lot worse. I was concerned that it was going to be more like a 2017, 2018, but we ended up having a handful of precipitation events. And again, I don't want to say that it was a wet winter, but it could have been much drier. So we had a couple of events that put down a little bit of snow and a little bit of rain that recharged soil in some locations. But again, it wasn't anything to make up the deficits that have accumulated over the last 12 months. And interestingly too, the temps really did moderate. You know, La Nina winters can be a bit warmer than average, and that was certainly the outlook, but temps were actually quite moderate. We ended up having a lot of storm systems, which I'll show you, that kind of slid into the Intermountain West and brought us these cool downs. And so it really helped kind of keep temperatures in check a little bit. Again, it still leaned a little bit above average in some locations, but overall the region was kind of near normal. And then part of that whole story is just looking at some of the growing degree days accumulations. This is since January 1st, and this is a gridded product from the Climate Toolbox. You kind of have to assess it on your own, the quality of this data, but it's using gridded data daily to accumulate growing degree days. And again, I would really check with the local mesonet and ASMET here for the local conditions, but this at least gives you a portrayal of the cumulative temperatures, and this has got a 40-degree base, and these are the anomalies. So the temperatures since January 1st, a couple of those warm days and a couple of those warm periods pushed a little bit, and so there's a slight lean towards slightly ahead schedule, but it's pretty close to normal across much of the low deserts here in Arizona. And then a couple of plots that I look at that are station-based and just accumulating the total precipitation since October 1st. This is for Phoenix, just to point out those couple of precip events. So starting on October 1st, didn't really have any recorded precip in October and November, and then December, January, and then February was missed here, but March, we ended up having a couple of precip events. And the most significant one was the one in late January, I think everybody remembers. And so that actually put down the most precipitation over a run of days and kept temperatures in check. And then the bottom there shows you the daily temperatures. The little red dots are records for the day. And you can see that October, November was very warm, and then temps moderated December, January, a little warm up in early February. And then just more recently, we started to see those temps push to above average levels. And then this is Tacna. This is a station down towards Yuma, so in between Yuma and Phoenix. This is a really nice long-term record, and I'd like to look at it for some of the low deserts. And you could see that precip event was quite significant. It was like for the whole winter, put down most of its precipitation, and so Tacna's at a little over 1 1/4 inches, and that almost put it to close to average. So it was interesting, those dry locations, low desert, that one event almost caught up on precip, but again, we fell behind with precip, and we're pretty much done for the season at this point. And just to kind of look at what happened this past winter, and it was an interesting one. You know, the La Nina event forming in last summer and then into the fall season, that's pretty much our single forecasting tool to kind of predict what the upcoming winter season is going to look like. And it was kind of La Nina-ish, and I think that we ended up having a drier than average winter because of it, but the pattern was a little bit unusual, and I'll have to show you that. But you can see there's a ridge across the Eastern Pacific, which is completely expected during a La Nina event, and then more troughing through the middle part of the country, which we certainly did see. And that lower right panel there just shows you where it's unusual with respect to long-term averages. So those reds and oranges are where it was higher pressure than normal, and then the blues are where lower pressure than normal. And so that gave us this pattern that emerged and really did mostly steer the storms through the Pacific Northwest. And then if they did dive south, they were usually east of us. And so that gave us some of those snowstorms like we saw in Colorado, and then also the big freeze event in Texas. And so it wasn't too unexpected. But it's been interesting to look at some of the discussions around this La Nina event. And again, we still have a lot to learn on the seasonal forecasting end of it. But the La Nina pattern really didn't end up looking like the past. And so this top panel here is what we saw, and I kind of hinted at that in that previous panel there. And so the top panel is those blue areas where it was much lower pressure, and the red areas where it's much higher pressure. And the bottom is what you'd expect during La Nina. And so these bar charts down at the bottom here are just the correlations between past La Nina events and whether or not they looked like what we expect them to look like. And so that little green bar at the far right is our most recent winter, and it has almost a zero correlation with the past La Ninas. And so some of our more recent ones, like the 2011, 2012, which I think everybody remembers, a big drought year for Arizona in Texas and kind of the Great Plains was pretty typical, but this one didn't quite hang together. I do still think it was the reason we didn't end up seeing drier than average conditions, but the fact that it wasn't completely typical maybe allowed some of those precip events to sneak in, which we were lucky. Okay, so if we look forward here, I'll take a look through a couple of different timescales. We'll look at the 8 to 14 day temperature outlook. These are issued by the NOAA Climate Prediction Center, and some of these are issued every day. And so this was one I picked up yesterday. And this is an interactive plot. You drop a pin anywhere and you can start to see what the local conditions would look like. But basically the pattern is here, we expect to have warmer than average temperatures over the Western US, cooler than average over the Eastern US, and the strongest chances for it being above average are up over Nevada. And so the low deserts down here, we are kind of on the edge here. And so there's just a slight shift in the odds towards above average. And but I think that's probably a decent bet given what we've seen in the last couple of days. But it's not a super strong signal because the ridge of high pressure is really getting kind of knocked around and hasn't really set up in the models all that strongly yet. And then precipitation wise, the northern tier states looking to be drier than average, and the southern tier states looking to be wetter than average. And then here in the Southwest, what you're going to see on these forecasts now is that we're April, and the low deserts climatologically don't see a lot of precip in the historical record here. So you're going to see these equal chances forecast. So it's almost like a dry season mask that's going on these forecasts now. So there's really no shift in the odds towards above, below, or even near average at this point. So not much to say with the short-term outlook, but probably dry. And we see this is how these forecasts are made. It's actually an average of a bunch of weather maps, and really noisy map here, but the green lines give us an indication of the average upper level flow. And whenever the upper level flow bends towards the north and towards the poles, that's a ridge of high pressure, and that's going to be warmer and drier than conditions. And whenever it dips to the south, that's going to be cooler and sometimes wetter conditions. And so across the west there's that ridge, the bending up of those green lines towards the poles. And then they're kind of flat across the southwest. And that just indicates what we call zonal flow, and an indication that there still may be storm systems trying to move through here, but they're going to be dry. So we might end up seeing these kind of warm ups, cool downs, and then windy conditions. And we've already seen some pretty windy days. I'd expect that to be continuing the next couple of weeks. And then the week 3-4 forecast, pretty much the same thing. There's a slight shift in the odds towards above average temperatures. Again, that's that ridge that this is what happens this time of year here. Sun gets higher, heats up the land mass. It starts to draw in the subtropical high pressure system. And we expect to see these ridging events, but we can also have these winter storms that will try to push the ridge south. And so we'll end up getting warm ups, cool downs, and windy conditions, but definitely leaning towards above average temps through the end of this month. And then it's kind of a flip flop of that precip forecast we saw there. Below average precip across the southern tier states, and then much of Arizona and Southern California is in equal chances, and that's just because we're drying out. And then finally here, the La Nina pattern is winding down, and again, I think it was a bit of a player, but it's becoming less of a player because it's starting to fade. And then the thing that I'm a little bit concerned about, and it's probably nothing to be concerned about at this point, is that some of the models are suggesting a return of La Nina conditions this summer, and then maybe a second reprisal of La Nina conditions next winter, which would be problematic for the Southwest from a precipitation standpoint. But it's really too early. We're in this phase of time right now called the spring predictability barrier, and it's very hard for the models to see past the spring changes that are occurring naturally in the hemisphere. And so we won't really know if this La Nina risk is there until probably June or July. And so it's still something to kind of keep in the back of our minds. But right now that La Nina event is fading. And then finally here, I'll just give you a kind of a quick peek at some of the outlooks here. And I zoomed forward to the July, August, September outlook. This is really interesting, and we're going to kind of pick at this a little bit. The Climate Prediction Center is, the temp forecast at the top isn't particularly interesting. It's quite common here. The trends are just giving us above average temperature outlooks pretty much at all time scales. And that's probably a good bet. But this above average precipitation outlook that's showing up on the 3.5 month lead, and it'll be interesting to see how this gets updated in a couple of weeks, is suggesting an above average tilt in the odds, or a tilt towards above average precipitation for the monsoon season. There's a little bit of discussion around maybe an early start, maybe a more robust start. And that has to do with some of the models pointing at this, and this kind of weak relationship with snowpack. If we have lower than average snowpack and lower than average soil moisture in the kind of Four Corners region, some research suggests that pulls in moisture earlier. It's not totally, doesn't show up in every study, and so it's a little bit contentious, but it's interesting to sort of see this show up. And it's also interesting to see the dynamical models sort of suggest this too. And this would be really helpful, especially thinking about water into the future, is having that wet soil moisture in the summertime really helps condition the soils and stream flows for the following winter. And then just looking across all of these timescales, warm, 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 at all timescales above average, and that's trend really being picked up in a lot of these outlooks. And just heads up too, the normals are changing. NOAA is changing. The normals period changes every 10 years. And so the new normals period of 1991 through, did I get that right? No, it'll be through 2020 will be coming online soon, which will change the normals that all of these outlooks are being adjusted to. So it'll be harder to get an above average outlook, because the whole newer period will be warmer as it moves forward. So there'll be some adjustments, and we'll have to talk about that over time. And then the precipitation outlooks, it does show you that June, July, August, September, August, September, October periods with that precipitation, the above average, the lean towards above average precipitation showing up on those outlooks, and then it kind of fades away as we get into next fall. So it really is focused on the monsoon season, and I'll be really interested to watch these outlooks get adjusted and tweaked, and they're going to get done the third Thursday of every month. So a couple weeks, we'll see the new update, and there'll be more discussion around what we're seeing in the models. Sort of finally here, those La Nina conditions, they've been around, most likely impacted our weather since November. And I do think that's why we ended up a little bit drier than average, even if it wasn't a completely typical La Nina event. Only major precip event we saw the entire winter was that one in late January. And so drier than average conditions over the last 4 months and near average temps. These drought conditions, they're pesky, sticking around, but we are also moving into our climatologically dry season. So we're not going to really see any relief or any big precip events until the monsoon season shows up. And so warmer than average temps probably the best bet in dry conditions for the next, probably through mid-June. And then we have to start looking towards that monsoon season onset. And we'll just have to see where we're at there. So thanks so much for having me today. And I'll certainly be happy to field any questions in the chat box.
Hey, thank you, Mike. And again, if you have any question for Mike, you can chat him or put the question in the chat box, and also email Mike as well. Now we'll move forward with our next presentation. Our next speaker is Mohammed Mahmoud, and he is Senior Policy Analyst with Central Arizona Project. And the presentation will be about update on water supply conditions in Arizona. And with now, Mohammed, it's all yours. If you want to share your screen.
Yes, thank you, Ayman. I will share my screen. As Ayman mentioned, I'm a Senior Policy Analyst at the Central Arizona Project, and my department primarily focuses on long-term water supply reliability, and as it relates to largest source of our renewable water supply in the state of Arizona, which is from the Colorado River system. So what I'm planning to share really is just a, sorry, just a second here. Really just share with you, and this segues really nicely with Mike's presentation on our sort of climate outlook. What does that translate to the supplies that's going to be available to us in terms of water resources for our states, looking at our primary really supply of renewable water resources, which is from the Colorado River. And this really is actually a presentation that I was provided to our board really about a week ago. So this is maybe not the latest and greatest, but still the most recent and still relevant. Not a lot has changed since we gave this presentation. So usually we start off to give a quick overview of the reservoir conditions in the basin. Most of our water supply is generated in the upper basin. About 92% of the water supply is generated in the upper basin. And as I'll show you in the follow-on slide, really most of that upper basin supply is really traced back to three main tributaries and watersheds. For our concern in terms of how supply conditions in the upper basin translate to the supply available to us in the lower basin, and specifically in Arizona, we really focus on two primary reservoirs, and that is Lake Powell and Lake Mead. Lake Powell really is sort of the collection reservoir, overall collection reservoir of water resources generated in the upper basin. And in terms of the supply that's available to us in Arizona and our fellow lower basin states of California and Nevada, we look at Lake Mead. The health of Lake Mead really indicates the amount of water that is available to us on a year-to-year basis. So as Lake Mead goes down, because there are less releases coming from Lake Powell, because there's less water resources, stream flow being generated in the upper basin, that could put us into a potential scenario where we could suffer a shortage as a state. And usually, as it stands, if there is a shortage, most of that, or almost all of that, is really absorbed by Central Arizona Project, and that really translates to our customers in Central and Southern Arizona, of which there's a huge agricultural component. So just to draw the connection there. So when we prepared this report, Lake Powell was at about 3,569 feet elevation, 37% capacity full. Lake Mead was, more importantly, Lake Mead was at 40% capacity full, elevation 1085 feet. If in the month of August, we look at the 2-year outlook report prepared by the Bureau of Reclamation called the 24-month study, and we see that the forecast for the end of the year, beginning of the next year, is below this red line that we're referring to here as a tier 1 shortage, which is at elevation 1075 feet, then we would be triggering going into a shortage mode for the following year, and that would begin the reductions to Arizona. So we're close, we're not exactly there, and like I said, this really is determined in August, in the August projection. So we're close, so it's something that we're certainly monitoring. And in the other end with Lake Powell, the red line mark there, that reservoir is the mid-elevation release, which is 3575 feet elevation. Once again, that's also determined in the August projections. If the elevation is less than that, then that reduces the sort of operating tier, which dictates how much water is released downstream from Powell to Mead. It's showing it is less than that line, but it's not triggered because we're not in August and looking at the August projection forward. So anyhow, just to give you an idea of the reservoir conditions, and particularly the two reservoirs that are important for us in Lake Powell and Lake Mead to determine supply. The other thing we look at, because this is a snow-driven system based on the snowpack that occurs in the upper basin, as I said, 92% of the supply is generated there. We track the snowpack or snow water equivalent or snowpack accumulation throughout the water year, starting in October, ending in September. And really our snowpack accumulation season really occurs between end of October and peaks off at April before we start to see the snow melt in the snowpack. I mentioned 3 tributaries that are important to us in terms of tracking snowpack and really the potential runoff and spring snowmelt that finds itself in the reservoirs downstream. Going from sort of north to south in the upper basin, we have the Green River in Wyoming. That's one of the key tributaries. The second is referred to as the Upper Colorado River tributary. And then going a little bit south than that towards Colorado/New Mexico, as you have the San Juan River basin. So all three of these tributaries combine to about 75% contribution to that upper basin runoff, or upper basin water generation, water contribution to the entire basin. Looking overall, the bottom graph here is showing you the overall SWE in the upper basin. We're generally, and this is true for the 3 tributaries, probably with the exception of the San Juan, we're looking at about 85 to 90% of the long-term median in terms of the snowpack that's being generated so far in this water year. So we're trending below average or below median. And so we're potentially expecting a less productive winter season with that regard. And so obviously what that means is when we look forward towards the spring runoff season, which is between April and July, that's when when the snowpack could translate into contributions to the reservoir. We're probably going to expect a less than average or less than normal spring runoff as well. So that could then translate to reduced water accumulating in the reservoirs, and could potentially, depending on how much it swings, could it potentially swing us to shortage sooner. So with that regard, I mentioned a projection study that's produced by the Bureau of Reclamation called the 24-month study. And so we track that as well on a monthly basis to give us the future outlook on supply for these 2 primary reservoirs we talked about that are of interest to us, like Powell and Lake Mead. And so this graph is from the March 24-month study. So the most recent study, the April one, has not been produced yet. And this particular graph is showing you the projected elevations in Lake Powell. And so what you'll see, just to illustrate, sort of the operation tiers in Powell are a little bit more complex. Essentially, the dotted lines that are horizontal are showing the demarcation between the different release tiers. For example, this dotted one up here, the equalization tier, if during the August study, we look at that projection forward to the end of the year, and we see elevations above this line, that generally means that the goal is to balance the contents of both Lake Powell and Lake Mead, because that means that Lake Powell is extremely high. And then the following 2, you have the upper elevation balancing tier and then the mid elevation balancing tier. There's more nuances to how the releases are determined, but in a very simple sense, the lower the elevations of Powell, generally, not always, could translate to less releases downstream. It's more complex than that, but just to give you a sense. The 3 lines here are just showing you different projections looking forward. The green is the maximum probable, which basically means that in all the simulations and the projections that were modeled, about only 10% of those individual time series exceeded this line. The most probable is the one that we look at as sort of more the median. 50% of the projections exceeded this value at a given month. And then the yellow is the minimum probable, which is sort of the lower end, indicating that 90% of the time series or traces that were modeled exceeded that. The idea is, if you look towards this, we're currently in the upper elevation balancing tier. And so there's a likely outcome where for 2022, we could be shifting down to the next release tier pattern. And then you have this other black vertical line is showing you a year further out. So what would happen in potentially 2023, so beyond end of year 2022. I think more directly, if we look at Lake Mead, similar idea with the three projections moving forward. The horizontal dashed lines are showing different tiers of Lake Mead, indicating whether we would be in shortage conditions. We're currently in what we refer to as DCP Tier 0, which is referring to the drought contingency plan. But the following lines indicate officially moving into further into tiers of shortage. Tier 1 at 1075 feet elevation, Tier 2 at 1050, and then Tier 3 is at 1025, which is not illustrated here. So we're currently in DCP Tier 0. If we look at the most probable, which is the main one we tend to look at, sort of the median forecast, there's a very strong likelihood that we're going to shift down into a Tier 1. And then if we look at end of year 22, so how we would operate in 2023, we're getting very close to a Tier 2. And so a lot of this is really connected to some of the earlier presentations, Mike, and prior, where we're seeing this sort of drier trend in terms of climate and hydrological conditions. So unfortunately, I don't want to paint it all as bad news, but once again, certainly in the latter part of these projections, we're still further out that maybe there's hope that within that later time frame, we could have a more plentiful winter season that could mitigate some of this current dry conditions that we face. And that's really all I wanted to share, and I'm happy to respond to any questions.
Okay, thank you, Mohammed. I think, yeah, between the good or so good news and so bad news, I think we are kind of going through reading the future somehow, and hopefully something good will happen. But thank you for this information. And again, if you have any question, share in the chat box or contact Mohammed directly. And with that, I think we will have about, let's say, 9 minutes break if you want to like grab something to eat or like want to stretch out, and we'll resume back at 12:25 with the rest of our presentation. So just this 9-minute break and we'll come back. Okay, time to resume our workshop, and we are going to our next speaker, Jordan Bell. She is agronomy specialist with the Department of Soil and Crop Science, Texas A&M Agri-Life Research and Extension Center in Amarillo. And today, Jordan will discuss with us some of the work she did with sugarcane aphid and the implication of the management. And it's all yours now, Jordan.
Okay, thank you so much for having me on your program again. As you mentioned, I briefly touched on some of this information last year, but I've since compiled our 2-year data set, so I have a more extensive data set to share. And I do hope that listening to the last 2 presentations on water, that you'll have an earlier La Nina and the monsoon season starts, because as we move into summer forage season, I know it's very stressful trying to make this work with drought. But because of that, the aspect of this that I'm going to show, I think is applicable. I'm going to focus on the insecticide treatments that we use and really stress that cheap insecticides and improperly managed insecticides can often cause a loss in return on the back end. So I do think that as we look at droughts and look at potentially lower forage production, I know that y'all are making those tough decisions and really trying to think about your net return, but often a cheaper insecticide is not the best option. So, of course, as we look at insects and forage sorghum, I first have on here spider mites in corn, and only because I routinely have producers tell me, since we've had sugarcane aphids come in, that even though they do not have the irrigation capacity for corn, they do not want to mess with sugarcane aphids in forage sorghum. But we have spider mites in corn, and we get in hot and dry conditions, those are going to trigger those spider mite flares. And so it becomes just as costly to control the spider mites in corn as it does the sugarcane aphids in the forage sorghum. So that's really not, or sugarcane aphids are, I do not think are really the justification for not growing a forage sorghum. Now, a lot happens with regards to contracts, and especially in the high plains and eastern New Mexico, we have dairies that are still not excited about feeding forage sorghum. But even as the drought has expanded in our area where we have our greatest concentration of dairies and livestock operations, we see that forage sorghums are really becoming an option in those areas. So sugarcane aphid management is something that we are increasingly having to consider, but nevertheless, we should not be making a decision to plant corn when we don't have the water, because we will lose quality and tonnage more quickly in a corn crop. So these are some images from sugarcane aphid infested hybrids that I've had in my research at Bushland, Texas, which is right in the center of the Texas Panhandle, just west of Amarillo. This is a hybrid Great Scott, and this is actually looking at a rating scale that we have used in the Texas High Plains based off of a rating scale that was developed for grain sorghum. And it's a scale from 1 to 10, simply 1 being 10%, or 10 being 100% of that plant leaf area is either infested, damaged, or dead. And of course, with sugarcane aphids, when we are talking about damage, we're talking about the honeydew as well as the sooty mold that builds up. Not only does that reduce the photosynthetic potential of the plant, it also does create some harvest challenges. So on the left, we have an example of what would be about 20% infestation, but on the right, this was 80% infestation. And so at that level, not only do we have the senescence of the lower leaves, we have biomass that is obviously decreasing, but we also have a reduction in panicle exertion. And so when we think about the value of this forage crop and what the grain contributes to it, if it's harvested and managed properly, we are losing tonnage from the grain as well as the quality that we can also achieve from that grain. This is a hybrid NutriChoice, very similar situation. We have on the left, good head development. On the right, poor head exertion due to the aphid pressure. And then, of course, when we get to 100% infestation, we usually, or heavy infestation with many hybrids, we can wind up with full lodging. And that is because, of course, as that plant is covered in the honeydew and the sooty mold, it's no longer assimilating those carbohydrates, and the stalks will cannibalize, or the plant will cannibalize its stalks, and we lose the stalk strength. And so we wind up with a significant challenge with harvest quality and forage loss. So in response to this, I worked with our extension and research entomologists, Ed Bynum and Pat Porter, and we established a trial looking at yield and quality losses from sugarcane aphid infestations. And we were not just focused on, though, the quality of the fresh forage, but also I had been receiving questions from livestock nutritionists about the quality of the ensiled forage. And that had been a very big concern. If they accept loads of forage that's covered in sooty mold, and if, for those of you who have seen it, it can be pretty nasty looking. What happens in that silage pit? Does the quality continue to degrade in the silage pit? Or are we actually looking at a product that is stable during that or after it has been ensiled? So, of course, when we look at forage sorghums grown for silage production, the populations have been variable, especially in recent years. The last 2 years, we have actually seen those populations lower than in the past. There has been speculation about beneficials adapting, and hopefully that is a trend that will continue. But the seed industry has responded, and we are starting to see those hybrids that are sugarcane aphid resistant also build up or become available on the market. The damage potential had not been previously established for grain sorghum, so that was an important objective of this research. And our objective was to create different levels of sugarcane aphid infestations and correlate the subsequent level of damage to forage sorghum yields and silage quality. And then we used different insecticides to create different infestation levels. And that was the beauty of working with entomologists, is that they had a really good understanding of how the insects would respond to these different insecticides. And we did quantify this by sampling within each plot. Our plots were 10 feet by 30 feet, and they were actually, we had 4 replications of each treatment. And we sampled 5 plants, an upper leaf as well as a lower leaf. We did counts as well as the ratings for the damage every week so that we could quantify the change over time. And so, of course, a big part of today's discussion has been water. And I really do think it's important that when we point out infestation, we need to think about yield and quality losses in water limited environments as a result of poor insect management result in decreased water use efficiency. And that was something that was pointed out with regards to the alfalfa earlier today. We are looking to maximize the production per unit of water. And so any lost crop becomes a waste of water. And that's why it's very important that as we think about maintaining our quality and our tonnage with our insecticide programs, that we are also not just maintaining forage, but we are maintaining that water use efficiency. The hybrid that we used was Pioneer 841F. This is a hybrid that is very susceptible to the sugarcane aphid. And what we have seen is that when the sugarcane aphids come in, it's almost a magnet. Because of that, Pioneer is really no longer marketing this hybrid very much in the high plains. They replaced it with Pioneer 845F. But we did evaluate this for 3 years in our trial. The trial was started in 2017. We were actually hailed out in 2018. And then our final data set was 2019. As I mentioned, we had different insecticide treatments to flare the sugarcane aphids. Of course, we had an untreated check. We came in with Warrior 2, and this was a treatment where we expected to have very high aphid levels, and that is because that chemistry kills the beneficial insects, resulting in those flare of sugarcane aphids. We also had Lorsban that has a very short residual activity, so about 50% control, and we expected moderate sugarcane aphid levels because of that. Intruder, another insecticide that does not have extended residual activity, so we anticipated only about 70% control with moderate sugarcane aphid levels. And then Savanto Prime, one that we have seen in our research to have very good control and activity. We looked at 3 different rates the first year with a low rate giving us still long residual but good control, relatively low sugarcane aphid pressure is what we anticipated, all the way up to the full rate, looking at very good control and long residual with very low aphid pressure. In 2019, we replaced the Lorsban and the Intruder with a malathion, and that behaved very similarly to those other insecticides. So looking at the infestation over time, what we saw is that the aphids responded as anticipated. These low bars on the left, that actually represents the 3 different rates of the Savanto prime treatment. What we saw early on was that the untreated check and the warrior started to increase most rapidly. And so we saw those sugarcane aphids, especially as we got into the beginning milk stage, in the forage development, the aphids were already building up to close to 600 sugarcane aphids per leaf. By the time we reached milk stage, we saw that the sugarcane aphid pressure in those 2 treatments was over 1,000 aphids per leaf. And then in the Lohr's band, as well as in the intruder treatments, we were now starting to build up aphid colonies and aphid pressure in those treatments. And by the time we reached early soft dough, which would be the ideal time for the harvest stage or harvest stage for forage sorghum for ensiling, we found that we still had very good control in our Savanto treatments. In the intruder as well as the Lohr's band treatments, we had moderate activity. And then of course, in our untreated check in the warrior, there was no significant difference, but we actually had higher sugarcane aphid pressure in that warrior treatment. And what we did hypothesize that was because we had killed those beneficial insects. So because of that, those aphids were expanding more rapidly in the warrior treatment than they even were in the untreated check. Because even though we had not applied an insecticide in the untreated check, we still had beneficials. And so those beneficials were still contributing some activity and keeping that aphid pressure low. This is just a visual of the scale that I mentioned earlier. Having a rating of 0, we had no aphids or honeydew, and then all the way to 10, more than 90% to 100% of that leaf area being damaged. So looking at the damage in that year based off of the aphid pressure that we had, we saw that the damage was very reflective of the aphid pressure. In the untreated check and the warrior treatments, we had damage that was close to 50% by the time we reached the beginning milk stage, of course, meaning that at least 50% of the leaf area was infested or damaged. And then very quickly, by the time we reached milk, the Lohr's band and the intruder damage had already started to increase close to 50%, but the untreated check and warrior were now over 80%. And so by the time we reached our harvest stage, we saw that in those 2 treatments, we were already over 90% and had significant damage due to that. 2019, and we saw a very similar trend, although we had lower aphid pressure in 2019 as a whole. In Texas, our sugarcane aphids do move up from the Rio Grande Valley, and so depending on the intensity of the winter, how far back they're pushed during the winter, as well as one of the things we also anticipated in 2019 was grain sorghum acres. Grain sorghum acres in Texas were down, and so in visiting with our entomologist, he had hypothesized possibly that with that reduction in grain sorghum acreage, there was just a slower spread of the sugarcane aphid in that year than there had been in previous years. Now this year, grain sorghum prices are very strong, and we are anticipating grain sorghum acreage to be higher. So there's a possibility, just due to the variability of that we could again see higher sugarcane aphids, although we had this horrible winter freeze in February, and I had been told that sugarcane aphid colonies that had been identified in Central Texas had been killed by that freeze. So, you know, it's interesting depending on where you are regionally, and I don't know what direction your sugarcane aphids come in, but they definitely could be impacted by weather events in other regions. So what we saw, though, of course, with our warrior as well as our untreated check, that we had those very high sugarcane aphid or higher sugarcane aphid infestation levels. In 2019, we actually did include 2 untreated treatments, specifically because we were relying on natural infestation. And just knowing that we tend to have more variability with natural infestation versus artificial infestation, we wanted to account for just natural sugarcane aphid pressure. And so we had 2 different untreated checks randomized throughout the field. Looking at the malathion, we also saw that the sugarcane aphids did build up in that malathion. But this is where actually it was interesting. The sugarcane aphids just dropped off for whatever reason. They just, in all treatments, kind of disappeared by the time we reached that milky soft dough stage. So right before it'd be ready to chop for silage. Now looking at the damage though, what we saw was that regardless of the disappearance of those sugarcane aphids, the damage that occurred in that milk stage progressed throughout that soft dough stage. So even though we saw our aphids disappear, having the pressure during those earlier reproductive stages was impactful to the damage level that we saw, and the plants did not recover. So our results, our 2-year data set confirmed that the cheaper insecticide selection resulted in greater sugarcane aphid infestation and damage because the beneficials were killed, and of course we also had shorter residual activity. Now, a question always is yield. How did this pressure and damage affect the yield? And looking at that grain sorghum rating scale from 0 to 10, we saw that of course there was a very linear relationship to yield. As the sugarcane aphid damage increased, our yield decreased, such that by the time we had reached a rating of 8 or 80% of that leaf area infested, we had lost over half of the yield. 2019, it was not as significant of a drop in yield, but nevertheless, we still had that same trend that as the sugarcane aphid infestation increased, we had a reduction in yield. So the 2-year data also confirmed a yield reduction with increased sugarcane aphid damage. Now, forage nutritive value, as I mentioned, was one of our initial objectives in response to questions within the livestock industry. And so some of the parameters that we looked at were starch, ADF, relative feed quality, and total digestible nutrients. We had reduced starch because of the sugarcane aphid, and that was because of the reduced panicle exertion and reduced grain production that I had shown you all in the previous pictures. We had increased ADF, which is the acid detergent fiber. The lower the ADF, that's an indication of forage digestibility. The lower the ADF, the better the digestibility. We also had a reduced relative feed quality, and one of the previous speakers spoke about RFQ and TDM being an indice for feed quality, and really looking at those as an indication for the value and the nutritive value of that forage. So what about the ensiled forage? Well, we had 3 different ensiling periods, of course, 0 days being the fresh forage right from the field. We also ensiled for 30 days, and then we ensiled for 60 days. And looking at that acid detergent fiber, we saw that, of course, in 2017, these top 3 lines, that we had a more rapid increase in the acid detergent fiber with the sugarcane aphid damage as a result of just the pressure that we had that year. But nevertheless, there was a very similar slope and trend with regards to all ensiling periods, especially this 0 and 30 day. And there was actually no significant difference between these periods. So what we saw was that the quality going in was essentially the quality going out with regards to ADF in 17, and then the very same trend in 2019 as well, even though as a whole we had lower ADF and more improved digestibility that year. Relative feed quality, also very similar trend. As the sugarcane aphid damage increased, we saw that our relative feed quality decreased with a greater reduction in 17 than in 19. Now, of course, cost is very important. And as we think about just the return, looking at the cost of the forage based off of the year we started in 2017, forage sorghum in the high plains was bringing $40 per ton. And what we saw going from our damage level of 0, and actually based off of those regression lines, with a damage of 1 to 10, we saw, of course, our yield was projected to decrease from 23 tons to 15 tons. And of course, this was also based off of the actual yield data that was collected within those plots. And so we see the correlation in the reduction in the price of that forage going from $900 per acre down to $587. So the results indicated a need for a revised action threshold for sugarcane aphid management in the forage sorghums. This was actually samples before they were ensiled, just looking at the sugarcane aphid infested fresh forage versus non-sugarcane aphid infested forage. And you can really see that even just chopping, we had a hard time actually getting a good cut. The forage tore. It was just, not a good quality. The dry matter was very high in the sugarcane aphid infested forage at that soft dough stage. And so if we're talking about silage quality, it's not just the nutritive value, but also the quality of the that ensiled product. And having this high dry matter product, we're going to result in packing issues, air pockets possibly in the silage pit. And so this would potentially result in a lot of issues, and especially palatability. So looking at those revised action thresholds, what we saw is that with pre-boot infestation, if we have 20% of the plants infested with 50 or more aphids, we need to pull the trigger and consider a sugarcane aphid management plan. Same thing at boot, still looking at 20% of the plants infested with 50 or more aphids. By the time we get to the flowering or milk stage, if we have more than 30% of the plants infested with 50 or more aphids, we need to pull the trigger. And then by the time we do reach soft dough stage, it becomes a question of harvestability. And of course, there's issues with pre-harvest intervals for insecticides too. So we really need to step back and see, is it going to be economical to harvest, and probably only treat if there are going to be harvest problems. So our results confirmed that, again, the cheaper insecticide resulted in a confirmed cheaper insecticide selection resulted in greater sugarcane aphid infestation and damage because we killed the beneficials and had a shorter residual activity. We confirmed a yield reduction because of the increased damage, and we also confirmed a reduced nutritive value with increased damage. So just in summary, we really need to be thinking about managing those sugarcane aphids, making sure we're using proper insecticides so that we can ensure the quality of the fresh forage, but also the quality of the forage that is being ensiled, because that is dependent on the fresh forage. So if there's any questions, I can take them at this time.
Thank you, Jordan. And I think this is really quite interesting results. For many years, we have been talking about how different the forage sorghum from the grain sorghum in terms of their behavior toward the infestation of sugarcane aphid, and for the need to having a different threshold for the sugarcane aphid for the forage sorghum. And I think these results really good in terms of giving us some insight on how to deal with these serious pests. So for any question, feel free to communicate with Jordan, or contact me and we can discuss that, and I can facilitate the question to her. And I appreciate really the contribution that you have today.
Definitely. Thanks again for having me.
Thank you. Next, we will have our next speaker is Ross Turnstead, and he is the ag economic specialist with the University of Arizona. And today he will discuss with us impact of state-derived alfalfa export on their prices. Ross, it's all yours. Oops.
Okay, can everybody see my screen and hear me?
Yeah.
Okay, yeah, so this is a topic that's been of interest to me and I think others as well too, but just what is the impact of exports on prices and in particular by state? And in regards to this, Elena Chin and Ibrahim Asal have done a lot of the work on putting this together. I just note here one item here, if you'd like to receive kind of updates in terms of current situation, like on hay stocks, pretty much every December there's a hay stocks, and I have a livestock monitor newsletter to send out. And if you're interested in receiving that, just send me an email at tronstad@ag.arizona.edu, and I can add you to that list there. Just to give a little kind of perspective here, this is a dot map here of alfalfa harvested acres from 2002, a few years ago, but you can see alfalfa production is scattered, around the U.S., but there's very little in the southeast down here, as well as even in Texas. And if you look at, in the west, virtually all of it is irrigated. And we're going to be focusing quite a bit here just on these 7 western states here, because that's where virtually almost all of the exports here of alfalfa come from, is our 7 western states. And I put the next graph up just on irrigated acres in the U.S. to show that not all irrigated acres relate to just alfalfa production. You can see there's a lot here in the plains. Irrigation involves, grain production, a lot of corn, a lot down here in the Delta with related to rice and whatnot. And even in the Southeast, there's a lot of irrigation, but it doesn't overlap, with the irrigated alfalfa acreage or the production. And also another interesting graph I find here too as well is just a look at kind of the changes we've had in terms of irrigated acres. This is looking at the census data from 2007 to 2012. And you can see we have a lot of red here in the Texas Panhandle up in this region, the Ogallala Aquifer in this area as well. But even across, a lot of the west into California, there's a lot of red. There's some blue dots as well. Most of the blue dots, though, in this period were over here in the Delta region and is down along here in the southeast. And we have some red and blue here in Arizona, and that coincides pretty much with what we see in terms of our Arizona ag stats in terms of our acreage here, in the sense that, since about 2000 here, our total acres have been, fairly flat across the state. Actually, going back to, about 80, 82, 83, we had a big crash here, in part because of the Payment in Kind program, as well as the Arizona Groundwater Management Act in the 1980 that dropped acreage quite a bit. With the PIC, the Payment in Kind, producers were paid to not grow, and they responded there. And there's also been kind of a disaster for farm policy, but referred to. But you can see Arizona's been fairly flat over this period in total acres, but we've had a big shift in the sense we've shifted from a lot of cotton to a lot of alfalfa, so that alfalfa is our largest crop acreage here in the state. And most of that acreage has come from our central Arizona counties. We've always had strong production on the Colorado River counties, and they've kind of been strong producers throughout this whole period and fairly consistent. But it's the central Arizona counties that have really increased in terms of their production here, over the last 30 years here. And why is that? Basically, if you look at it in terms of kind of the ratio of upland revenues relative to alfalfa revenues, you can see cotton was, about 50% greater in terms of expected revenue per acre in the 70s and 80s here. And then as we got into the 90s here, you can see that the alfalfa revenue per acre started to exceed that of the upland cotton per acre, and it's kind of been on a downward trend. And what has that contributed to that revenue? We have both yield and price components going on. If we look at the yields just in Pinal County, you can see the relative yields for cotton and alfalfa have been fairly flat over this period. And most of it's been due to the price in terms of the alfalfa price, starting to pull away from the cotton prices here along in the early 90s here. And there's a lot of factors contribute to that, but one of the things that was going on during this period here is that we started to have our exports here take off here. And I guess on this graph here, you can see early on, Japan was kind of the largest importer of alfalfa from the US. And then 2008 here, we have China come along, and they take off and really move along with the exports there, and have to where they become the largest exporter of alfalfa from the US. And other countries have also increased quite a bit in recent years, Saudi Arabia in particular. And if we look at the value, you can see it's pretty close to the following the graph in terms of on the tonnage, but you can see that it has the volume, or the value here wasn't quite as it dipped down as much as the value here in 2020. It tended to keep up there a little better. So some of the questions here we might have, and just looking at things is, oops, what happened? I went back one. I don't know, we'll go back. Oh, there we go. So not all states here necessarily contribute equally to this, 900 million in alfalfa exports that we show here. And another thing is there's a lot of differences in our kind of regional and state demand in terms of what we see, like in prices in the Midwest, Great Plains versus, Texas, or, there's a lot of state level demands, and there's also, export demand as well, but then there's kind of regional markets going on in terms of demand for the alfalfa. And, in large part, the dairy is one of the largest, or a large demand for, alfalfa that's going for export in terms of the higher quality alfalfa, because that is, what is being exported there. And the other thing too is, you think about it, alfalfa is relatively expensive commodity to transport, especially if you compare it to, like, say, even cotton. Cotton you can press and everything as well, but 70-cent pound cotton, that's like $1,400 a ton alfalfa in terms of transportation. So alfalfa is relatively expensive to transport relative to cotton or soybeans, where you just can move them, from one rail car to another, and without having to have a lot of heavy equipment for there. But the other thing too we have with alfalfa is known for being like a water, inefficient crop in terms of the amount of pounds that it produces relative to the amount of water it consumes. So, we like to, in economics, we like to think of efficiency though more in terms of the value of the output or the value of the input, but we're left to kind of defend ourselves in terms of the industry, just what what is the value here in terms of our exports, in terms of why are we exporting some of our scarce water? This here just shows a glance here, I guess, in terms of looking at how hay prices do vary, from state to state. This is just pulled this off of the hay and forage from the other day. And you can see, we can have California here at the top, premium prices 205 to 290. But, if you go down to like, say, Oklahoma, they'll give a range for that premium 170 to 200, quite a difference there. And so that's why in terms of when looking at these prices, we look at a spatial model so we can look at kind of the direct effects in terms of exports, from that region, as well as the impacts, or what we call the indirect effects, in terms of being next to a neighboring state that would export from that. So when you look at alfalfa production, the largest state here for 2020 in terms of production was Idaho. Excuse me, but you can see Arizona comes in producing, 2.2 million tons, fairly significant, especially when you consider that California is only, like 3.4 million tons. We're less than half of what Idaho has, but we're a pretty significant contributor here in terms of alfalfa production here in Arizona. Another thing to note on this map here is Texas. Only 539,000 tons of alfalfa, but yet they're the largest state in terms of what they produce in terms of total hay, because they have an awful lot of grass hay and wild hay. And a lot of that hay goes, for livestock, but is not necessarily suited for the dairy industry. So that's why we have a lot of these state impacts. So in terms of trying to estimate the impact of our state exports, first we have to kind of figure out what are the exports that are going for each state. So prior to 2002, we basically just have California, Oregon, and Washington that are really exporting much. So we just use the port data to estimate in terms of the state level exports for there. So everything that's shipped out of the port, in San Francisco, Long Beach, and San Diego, goes to California. Everything that goes out of the Columbia goes to Oregon, and then everything out of Seattle pretty much goes to Washington there. After 2002, we use the percentage of each state's export value, this number here, this 121490, because that is the state level export value that is reported for all forage, but they don't report one for alfalfa, or the 124900010. But the ports do report that. So then we estimate each level state value based on the value that gets imputed then to the tonnage that each state would account for from all the ports. So that's just kind of a general explanation, doesn't include all of the details, but that's how we estimate the state exports in terms of what's coming out for all the ports. So when we do that, this is the derived state exports that we would come up with here. And this is cumulative graph. So you can see here that most, Washington and California account for, a good percentage of the exports. And we have Arizona down here as well. With regards to just looking at it on an individual basis on the state, you can see California is just a little bit above Washington, and then we have Oregon, and then Utah coming in ahead of Arizona, and then Idaho, and Idaho down here in the purple, and Nevada in the gray, being fairly small. It's kind of interesting, Idaho being small since they are a fairly large alfalfa producer, but they also have very large dairy industry here as well. So how does this relate to in terms of the percentage of production that's exported? You can see Washington has by far the most percentage, about 50%. Then California here around 40%. Oregon, a little maybe 22% here in recent, 2020. And Arizona is probably down here around that, 6-7% in there in terms of for 2020 in terms of the amount that we export of our production there. So in terms of how that relates to on a national basis, you can see, all alfalfa is around just, less than 5% if you look at all of it. Of course, it's greater for these 7 Western states because that's where all the exports are coming from. But it's overall alfalfa is relatively small compared to like soybeans, where around 50% is exported. Corn, 15%, fairly bit smaller. But cotton and nuts, over 70%, and in the West, 100% is pretty much exported. So just to give you, we don't have time to get into everything in terms of how we come up with these estimates here, but these are just some of the variables that are involved in terms of trying to estimate spatial autocorrelation model to where we can come up with these direct, indirect, and total estimates with regards to how exports are impacting state level prices. So our dependent variable is the price of alfalfa at the monthly alfalfa price. We have annual production here, so that just changes once a year, even though we have monthly prices. The same production is put in for every month. Hay stocks, that's updated twice. We have alfalfa exports that are up for monthly. We have, dairy cow inventory. Some states we have monthly, but some are just annual, and we estimate, the monthly based on some of the milk data. We have state monthly milk prices, calf prices, corn prices. We also use precipitation. Literature is saying that in this case, the higher the precipitation, the lower the price, and mainly due to quality there. And then we also use a producer price index for fuel to account for some of the production costs there. So basically, we do also have an interaction term here between the dairy cow inventory and the alfalfa exports, but pretty much linear in functional form for most of this. So when we look at the direct effects here in terms of what we would estimate would be, once we calculate the marginal effect, and then we take the total exports for the state for 2020, this is the price per ton that we would get an impact in terms of how exports impact the price of alfalfa for the state. So for California, we would estimate for this model here, and there's also several different ways to handle the distance and how close you are, but for this model here, this is more of the local model, so we could calculate these marginal effects here for 2020. But you can see for the direct effects here, we have California, the largest being at like $21 a ton, next Washington, $16, Arizona at like $2.31 per ton, and Utah here at $4.25. But what you'll note when we look at the indirect effects, they're much larger for, like Arizona and Nevada and Oregon and Idaho. So that even though these states aren't exporting directly, we're next to states that are direct exporting a lot. So I mean, Arizona is exporting some, but California is exporting a lot. So that pulls up the price of Arizona more than actually the direct effect. Oregon has a large indirect effect because it has both Washington and California on both sides of it that are exporting. So when you add both of those together, then you get what we would call like a total effect here in terms of the impact of the exports. So if you take these prices over here for these 7 Western states and multiply, kind of by their production for 2020, you would get approximately about 210 million for these 7 Western states. So, I guess if you were thinking of it in terms of water, if you were to $100 an acre foot, that's 2.1 million acre feet of water. If you're $1,000 an acre foot, that's 210,000 acre feet. So I guess that's one way of kind of looking at the relative value there of the exports in relation to the water. I guess one thing about exports is that there's no restrictions in terms of how exports of alfalfa can move across state lines, across international boundaries with no restrictions. But when it comes to moving the water in terms of like a water market, we know there's a lot of restrictions in terms of moving that across state line. So another graph put in here to kind of look at is just the state prices here with regards to alfalfa, just to show where we get some of that spatial differences. So you can see the bluer ones down here in North and South Dakota. They're the lower price. You get into the green here, Texas and New Mexico. They're some of the higher, and you can see Arizona and California here in kind of the red. They tend to move together because they're next to each other, but notice that they can be quite a bit different from the prices that you observe, like North South Dakota, or even nearby somewhat with Texas and New Mexico. So this just kind of shows that you do have regional markets here with respect to alfalfa, and that it just doesn't move as freely as like our grains do. Another thing I find interesting here too is if we look at the farm price versus the export price. You can see with soybeans on the brown here, the brown line and the brown dash, they're really pretty close to each other. They follow along quite well, and the corn as well. It follows quite in terms of the export being above, the farm price there a little bit, quite consistently throughout across here, but we see quite a divergence here when we look at alfalfa. And of course, one of the main reasons we have this big divergence here is because we have to put it into a different form. We have to compress it, to make it export ready. Plus, we have to ship this relatively bulky commodity to the port. And that is why we see a lot of these wide, I guess, differences in terms of sometimes it's fairly close, like you can see here in like, the 10, 11, 12, 13 in here. But then once you get away like more now, we're fairly distant in the sense that, we're at the export price, we're around $300, and we're around, like 180 or so down here for the US farm price. Just to kind of show how things are a little bit in price movements, you can see the export price here, the Arizona farm price and the national farm price, the blue line, and then that red being the 5-state dairy premium price. That's his price as part of the 2018 Farm Bill to track in terms of the 5 states that are the largest dairy producing states, how their premium alfalfa price is and how that should be recorded, because that's used in a lot of insurance, different things. Just kind of wrap up a little bit here. I guess I just note that, with regards to scarcity and, comparative advantage, definitely other parts of the world, have a much greater percentage of the population relative to, arable land. And it's not just water, but just arable land than the US. And, that's, one of the reasons why we have gains from trade and whatnot, and why we are an exporter of a lot of agricultural products, because, in part because we have a lot of relatively good share of the world's arable land relative to the population that we have there. And with that, I think I'll just stop at that and let Ayman get back to the rest of the program there. And I guess if anybody has any questions, we can put them in the chat or send me an email, probably about use up our time, but thanks.
Thank you, Ross. And we'll move forward with our next speaker, Steve Norberg. And Steve is a regional forage specialist with Washington State University, and he will discuss with us today his topic about how far can the genetics of alfalfa improve quality. Steve, it's all yours. I think you are still muted.
Okay, can you see the presentation and see me now?
Yes, you look good.
Okay.
Both are good, yeah.
Okay, well, I appreciate the opportunity to share with you today. This is a large project that I've been working on along with some other colleagues, but we really wanted to know how far the genetics of alfalfa, the range that we could improve the alfalfa quality. And cooperating with me on this is Long-Shi Yu at ARS, David Combs, the University of Wisconsin, Glenn Shoemaker with the University of Idaho, Goji Wang, Oregon State University, Don Llewellyn, Washington State University, Sen Lin, Washington State University, and Steve Franson from Washington State University. But not only were we interested in just looking at how far the genetics could improve, but also looking for molecular markers that we could move forward with in the genetics of alfalfa that we could work with and accelerate the breeding things that we're doing. So let me back up here. So this research was funded by the USDA NIFA project. And of course, that wouldn't have been possible without the National Alfalfa and Forage Alliance helping ensure that this occurred. So very grateful for both entities. So again, the objectives that we had in our study was to determine the quality at first harvest of 200 alfalfa plant introductions that came from the germplasm repository. And then also 150 came from the germplasm repository and 50 came from alfalfa breeders in the United States. Then we wanted to quantify that genetic diversity that's related to forage quality, and then identify genetic areas associated with the forage quality. And then look to search for molecular markers, and of course, extend the information, which I'm doing right now. So again, we grew the 200 varieties in an augmented treatment design, and we used vernal and Alpha-Rex High-Gest 360 as checks. The vernal being a low quality check and the High-Gest 360 being a high quality check. And then we did DNA analysis on the germplasm. And then we looked at the different fiber analyses, including NDF, NDF 24, 30, 48, KD, INDF, and TTNDFD, and many others. And so used their near infrared to determine these. And then we determined the genetic areas and molecular markers related to fiber quality. Again, as I mentioned before, we had a diverse germplasm. And then we had 52 varieties coming from S&W, Alpha-Rex, Legacy, and Blue River hybrids. So just looking back at the germplasm repository materials, where did they come from? So if we look at this, 138 of them came from North America, from both Canada and the United States. Turkey had 21 entries, Central Asia 14, Eastern Europe had 9, China had 8, Central Europe, including Czech Republic, Denmark, France, and Germany, each had 1 there, but 4 total from Central Europe. And then 4 from, or again, 1 from each from Greece, Morocco, Mauritania, and Spain, representing the Mediterranean group. And then we had 2 entries from Australia and Japan. So that's the 148 ones that we had from the germplasm repository. Now, where did we grow them? Well, we grew them again at Washington State at the Prosser Experiment Station, which has an elevation of 665 feet. And this is kind of one of the lower areas, kind of banana belts of Washington State. And then Union, Oregon, which is close to La Grande, and has an elevation of 2,791 feet. And then down here in Kimberly, Idaho, had an elevation of 3,924 feet. So this is just a picture Prosser, Washington, what the field looked like. For field experiments, this is one of the largest ones that I've worked with. And this is what it looked like at the second cutting in 2018. Quite a difference in plant heights and different types of alfalfa. So to deal with the number of alfalfa characteristics and the number of varieties, we did a canonical analysis for forage quality based on relative feed quality. And so I'll try to just talk to you a little bit about this. The graph is a little bit opposite what you'd normally think of. So you see the high quality entries are on the left side in the purple, and the low quality ones are on the right, kind of in the orangish red color there. And so we broke them down into 4 clusters, and we're going to talk about those clusters a little bit there. But this is how all those 200 varieties all kind of fit together based on RFQ. So looking at RFQ a different way, you can see here we had a range. So we had a high quality again on your left and low quality on your right, and RFQ on the vertical axis. And you can see in a high quality RFQ group, we went from 180 all the way up to 208 RFQ, all just variety based. And this is the average over the 3 locations. Also on each one of the graphs that I'm going to show you, see this dotted line. This is our high quality check, which is the Alpha Rex 360. This is what the vernal was for first cutting. Again, all this data is for first cutting. Look at crude protein. And again, if you look at this just by varieties alone, you can go from 21 to probably 26% crude protein, which is quite a difference. And again, all the purple ones were categorized by RFQ. And so RFQ did do a pretty good job of pulling out most of the higher quality crude proteins. Looking at ANDF, you want a low ANDF to have high quality. And here you can see range from 36 all the way up above 42. And again, just based on the variety. And the other thing that I want you to keep looking at is, so this is our high quality check here. How much room for improvement do we have? So you can see this area in here is our area for improvement for ANDF. We can still lower it. TTNDFD, the total tract neutral detergent fiber digestibility. Again, you can see a range here, and had one really good one up here, but it ranged from 43.5 all the way up to over 50 in the TTNDFD. And you can still see there's quite a bit of room for improvement above the HiGES 360. So we wanted to put a dollar value to what potential increase that we could see. And so highest value is to dairy cows. And so we looked at the dairy feedstuffs that are fed to dairy cows, and we used information that was put out by Dr. Bill Weiss, and he breaks the nutrients down into energy, protein, and fiber. And we use NEL for 2001 for the energy, metabolizable protein for protein. And in fiber, we want some fiber, but too much limits the animal's ability to eat more, which limits milk production. So this is a figure from Dr. Weiss, and this shows you here that dry matter intake per day, as we increase in vitro neutral detergent fiber digestibility, it increases. So the dry matter intake increases as the digestibility increases. And on average, 0.26 pounds, it will increase the in vitro dry matter digestibility, will increase ½ pound of fat corrected milk. So 0.26 increase in IV and DFD will increase fat corrected milk by ½ pound. So that's kind of the relationship that's used in this. And from that, he develops So this is your milk price across the top. And then here's your feed price here on the left. And so what I use in this experiment, in this example, was $16 per hundredweight for milk price, and figuring that the average feed cost into the diet was 8 cents per pound, for an adjustment of $5 per value of IV NDFD. So one thing I just think is really interesting is when you start looking at what goes, the value of alfalfa over a period of time. Again, this is from Tebb and Weiss, and it goes from September 2017 to June 2020. But it breaks it down and what the value price for the Pacific Northwest was for net energy lactation, metabolizable protein, and effective NDF. And as you can see here, the fiber, the ENDF and the NEL stay relatively close and don't change much. But look at the dramatic changes of metabolizable protein value and how it's dropped clear down here. And if I extended this on out, the protein price, you can see, heard about soybean prices being really high. It's shot probably back up again. So the protein price seems to be much more variable. Okay, now, so I went in and I calculated the values, averaged over locations, the value for protein, energy, and fiber from these alfalfa varieties, the 200 of them that were in there, calculated the minimum protein value and then the highest protein value, all based on varieties. And then here you can see our high quality check, what the protein value was, and then vernal, our low quality protein value check. And so you can see the range here is from $68 to $83 a ton, and energy value from $113 to $135 per ton. The net fiber value is from $50 to $61 a ton. And then this is that quality adjustment when the cows can't eat the hay because it has too much fiber in it. And so the quality adjustment was from $3.60 a ton all the way up to $100 a ton, which is very significant. And so we want to have the digestibility high in our hay. So here's the value, the minimum value based on nutrient value was $247, but a high of $372 in value per ton based on nutrient analysis. And you can see that we've already made some, adjustment over vernal, about $15 a ton there, but we still have another ways to go to get up to the $372 a ton. So wanted to break it down in a different way. And here you look at High-Gest 360, that was the response for these different factors. And we wanted to look and see what happened if we optimized all the constituents that go into our dairy quality hay. And so we had NDFD 48 at 63.5% digestibility. And then we had the optimum response was 67.7. So an added value of $20.82. So that's our big increases in value is going to come from digestibility of that fiber. Here we have crude protein at $23 for the High-Gest, and we can increase that up to $25.40. Excuse me. So the protein value is 23.9, and we can increase that up to 25.4% protein, which will bring an extra $5.79 per ton. Ash, if we lower the ash from 10 to 9.2, $2.24 worth of value. Lignin at $1.48. Fat content didn't have much effect, about 56 cents. NDICP at 24 cents and ADICP at 26 cents. When you can, if you start adding all the increased values, it comes up to almost $30 a ton that we have a potential to increase in our alfalfa hay. Well, you say some of these components are interrelated, and they are. And so we looked at what the court relation was it if we selected for NDFD48 and protein, how would this affect the other values that are in here? And so here you can see that if we select for NDFD48, we're actually going to get a lower ANDF, and if we select for protein, we're going to get a lower ANDF. That's all what we want. We want a lower ANDF. We're going to increase our protein. That's a positive relationship. Now ash is actually going the wrong way. So that's one thing that we're going to have some effect on, but it's only 48 cents that if it goes the wrong way. Excuse me, that's the correlation is 0.48 with protein. Lignin, 79 had a negative relationship, so lignin is going to go down if we select for those two. Fats are going to increase. And here, these two were not statistically significant. So really the only thing that really is going the wrong way was the ash content by selecting for NDFD48 or protein. So then we went in and we looked at where are these molecular markers and what did we find? And here you can see the molecular markers that were significant over 2 years across all locations. And we were able to find 80 NDF, UNDF 240, NDICP. This is a standard milk per ton at 48 hours. Sugar content, there's a NEL lignin based, and then TTNDFD, fat, and NDFD traditional 30. So we got some good markers to go after. So, quality and yield are both of interest, and so this is how the yield looked. And here you can see kind of a histogram of the yield. In other words, as the yield grows over, how many percent of entries were in this category. And you can see that the vernal was here, Higest was here, but we've got considerable room for improvement in yield there. And so looking at it in a cluster analysis, just looking at the yield, you can kind of see that it ranged in megagrams per hectare from around 20 all the way up to 36 over the 3 years, or excuse me, over the 2 years. And so looking at it, the relationship between yield and quality, we expected to be a more negative relationship and a more significant relationship, but here we had RFQ traditional, and here we have total yield, and our relationship was weak, which would be desirable. If that's, I'm not sure exactly why it was as weak as it was, but that's what we found. And so there's hope to be able to increase yield and quality at the same time. And with that, I'll lead you to the conclusions. There's room for genetic improvement, especially with digestibility and protein. Energy and protein carry the majority of the value of the hay. Digestibility genes have been located on the chromosomes, and they're the ones that are going to have the biggest impact. And yield and quality appear not to be as closely linked, and improvement is possible. And with that, I'll be happy to answer any questions that anyone might have.
Thank you, Steve. And again, if you have any question for Steve or for anybody else, you can, now it's a chance to either like unmute yourself and have your question, or you can post it on the chat box. Even after the meeting, just communicate us. You have my email address, Kyle's email, and many of the email address for our speakers today. Communicate with any question, or if you think about all of this information that we put together today, I think it's a lot of information to digest and to start having some question in mind as well. So with that, I would like to thank all the participants today. I would like to thank all of our speakers, and especially our external speakers who devoted their time today and shared their expertise with us.